Hey guys, tonight we step into the kind of place that only exists at the edge of town. Quiet, half forgotten, wrapped in mist and stitched together with silence. A place where the living don't linger and the dead don't always stay put. You're about to walk alongside a man who hears things in the dark that no one else can. A man who writes what he sees in a diary no one dares to read. You're about to enter the world of the gravekeeper's diary, but fair warning, you probably won't survive this if you're the type who sleeps with one foot dangling off the bed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The graveyard lay beneath a tangle of skeletal oaks, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky like bony fingers. Fog hung low, even in the daylight, clinging to tombstones and creeping over the worn gravel paths. It was not a place people visited, not really. The few who did came quickly, left flowers, and walked away without looking back. But for Elias Thorne, it was home. He was 62, gaunt and weather-worn, with a beard the color of old ash and eyes that rarely blinked. He lived in a small wooden cottage just inside the rusted cemetery gate, a building barely larger than a tool shed, though inside it was surprisingly orderly. There was a cot, a table, a kettle, and most importantly, the diary. He wrote in it each night without fail by candlelight, using the same worn fountain pen he'd had for decades. The pages crackled softly as he turned them, the ink soaking like blood into skin-thin paper. He never missed a night. Even if the cold gnawed at his fingers or the wind screamed outside, Elias would write. It was a compulsion he would admit if asked. But no one ever asked, and Elias never left. Tonight was colder than usual. The fog had turned nearly opaque, swirling thick around the mausoleums and angel statues like a living thing. The lanterns along the gravel paths flickered one by one, then steadied, though Elias hadn't lit them. He noticed. He always noticed. He'd long stopped questioning how things worked in the graveyard. The place breathed with its own rhythm. Sometimes the air felt too still, like it was holding something in. Sometimes it whispered when there was no wind at all. Elias poured a cup of lukewarm tea, listening to the kettle tick as it cooled. His boots were still damp from the late patrol, a habit he had kept circling the graveyard just after dusk, checking for broken gates, fallen stones, or disturbances. The diary lay open in front of him. He stared at the blank page, his pen hovering. The candle sputtered, then flared again. He began to write. October 14th. The fog came early, denser than yesterday. The west path is blocked stone from plot 79 shifted again. Repaired, but the soil feels loose. Might dig it again in the morning. There were footprints, small, bare, childlike. No children here, not for 30 years. His hand paused. The ink blotted slightly. He glanced at the door, still locked, still shut. He drew a slow breath through his nose. The kind of breath that steadies you when the walls seem too thin and the night too loud. Outside, something scraped softly against the cottage window. Elias didn't turn his head. He closed the diary and waited. At precisely 1:07 a.m., the knock came. 3 short taps, measured, intentional. It wasn't at the front door, but at the back, where there wasn't a door. Only an old boarded-up wall from when the cottage had been a tool shed long before Elias arrived. He rose slowly, each step deliberate, careful not to disturb the silence more than necessary. He reached for the candle, cupping its flame as he crossed the room. The tapping came again. Tap, tap, tap. He pressed his ear to the old wood. Heard nothing, but he smelled it. Damp earth, sweet decay, and something faintly metallic like rusted iron or old blood. His pulse slowed, not from fear, but from familiarity. He'd smelled that scent before. He backed away and sat down, opened the diary again. 1:07 a.m. The visitor returned. Same knock, same wall. The air smells like the South Crypt. She's watching again. The girl from the 7th row. Elias knew the graves by number, not names. Row 7. Plot 43 belonged to a girl named Elsie Whitcomb, buried in 1913. She'd drowned in the creek behind the church her body found days later, with her hair tangled in weeds and hands folded as if in prayer. No family came to claim her. The townsfolk gave her a pine box and a stone with no inscription. Elias had first seen her 6 winters ago, just after the frost broke. A small figure barefoot standing between the stones watching his window from a distance. He hadn't approached, didn't need to. If she wanted something, she would come closer. And she did, every year. On October 14th, tonight, by 2:13 a.m., the fog outside had thinned slightly. Through the window, Elias could see the crooked line of headstones leading toward the old chapel ruin at the far edge. Something flickered near the gate. Not light. Movement. He didn't go out. He never went out when she knocked. Instead, he poured another cup of tea, this time cold and bitter. He drank it anyway. His bones ached from the damp, and the scent still clung to the air, mildew and metal. The candle dimmed, casting shadows like ribs across the wall. And outside, near the willow tree, a child's voice sang softly. Off-key, almost humming. Just one line. Over and over, down in the water no one can see. Elias didn't smile, didn't shiver. He just leaned back, pen in hand, and wrote her words into the diary. For tomorrow, when no one would believe what the fog had whispered tonight. The song had stopped, but its echo lingered in Elias's chest like a pulse out of rhythm. Silence returned with a weight, as if the night were holding its breath just beyond the window pane. He set down the pen carefully, its nib still wet with ink, and stared at the wavering candlelight. The shadows along the walls seemed to shift when he didn't look directly at them. He didn't find that strange anymore. The graveyard had its own way of breathing. Its lungs were the soil and roots. Its eyes were old glass, and its voice came not from mouths, but from memory. Elias had long ago stopped trying to explain it. The living who asked never stayed long enough to understand. He leaned forward, cracked his knuckles slowly, and listened again. The wind had returned. It slipped around the edges of the cottage like fingers brushing fabric, and with it came a faint tapping, no longer at the wall, but somewhere deeper, more distant. Perhaps near the iron fence at the southern perimeter, or beneath it. At sunrise, the fog withdrew like an embarrassed guest, exposing the stones and paths with a thin sheen of dew. Elias stepped outside, with his lantern still lit. The early light did little to warm the ground, and the air smelled like wet bark and rusted hinges. He moved quietly, his boots crunching softly on gravel as he made his way past row 7. Plot 43 looked undisturbed, but the grass was pressed flat in a small circle, as if a child had been kneeling there all night. Elias knelt slowly, resting a hand on the damp earth. No footprints, no sign of digging, just the shape. Still, it was enough. He looked toward the old willow. The swing that hadn't moved in years was swaying slightly now, though the wind had stopped. He nodded once, then stood. There was work to do. Back at the cottage, he recorded the morning's finding in the diary. October 15th dawn. Plot 43 marked. Grass flattened again. She was here through the night. No change in the stone, no sound from the chapel. The willow swing moved unprovoked. Recommend salt line at threshold by tonight, just in case. He underlined the last sentence. Salt wasn't part of any official training. But then again, neither were most of the things Elias had learned in his 41 years at the cemetery. No one had trained him. He simply arrived. The man before him had vanished. No funeral. No trace. Just a diary left open to a page that read, "She doesn't like to be ignored." Elias had taken up the job without question. And the diary. Every page since had been his. That evening, the wind shifted. Not stronger, just wrong. It came from the east across the creek where nothing lived. Even the birds avoided that stretch. Elias lit the path lanterns early. their dim glow flickering against the creeping dusk. He stood for a moment at the cottage's doorstep, salt in hand, and drew a precise line along the threshold. Not a ritual, not a superstition, just a precaution. He'd learned long ago that certain rules needed following even if you didn't know why. Rule 1, never invite anything in. Rule 2, never answer by name after dark. Rule 3, always write it down. The act of writing grounded him, made things real, bound them to paper. The candle was already lit. The kettle hissed. The diary lay open. But tonight Elias hesitated. There was something in the air, not a presence and absence, like something had been here and now wasn't. He sat slowly, pen hovering again, the hairs on his forearms stiff despite the warmth. He dipped the nib into ink and the diary welcomed him with its quiet, waiting breath. October 15th, 8:37 p.m. Air changed, east wind. No knock tonight, but something watched. It wasn't her. Different cadence, heavier. Male, no footprints, no marks, but I feel it in the marrow. He stopped writing as the candle bent to one side, its flame responding to a shift in air that Elias hadn't felt on his skin. The flame dipped, then danced, and somewhere faint but distinct something groaned beneath the floorboards, a voice too low to understand. He did not stand, did not move. The rules were simple. He had not invited. He had not spoken, but it had found a crack. Midnight came like a tide, silent but unstoppable. The diary lay open still, but Elias was no longer writing. He sat in the chair by the small window, the candle now extinguished, the only light a sliver of moon through the warped glass. He watched the willow, watched the grave of Elsie Whitcomb, and then the door handle turned, not violently, not loudly, just once, a slow, deliberate click of metal. Elias's hand moved with a practiced grace, reaching to the drawer beside the cot. He retrieved a small pouch of iron shavings and placed it on the table. Another click, the latch strained, but the salt line held. Elias opened the diary, hands calm. He picked up the pen. 12:03 a.m. Not her. Definitely not. The door resisted. The handle stills. I will wait it out. The rules hold. For now. Outside, something circled the cottage. Not pacing, gliding. The way fog moves. The way regret sounds. A second shadow joined it near the swing, barely visible. Elias watched from behind the glass, not breathing. The swing began to sway again. This time a voice came with it. A man's voice. Croaking. Rough. Like it came from lungs soaked in water. You took her name. I'll take yours. Elias closed the diary, blew on the candle stub, and waited for the sun. The sun rose slowly, reluctant and pale behind a layer of heavy clouds. Its light did not warm, did not reach far into the hollows of the cemetery. It simply revealed things that the night had left behind. Elias opened the door cautiously. The salt line remained unbroken, no signs of intrusion, but the handle was cold, far colder than it should have been. He stepped out onto the path, eyes scanning the immediate surroundings. The mist had thinned, retreating into patches that clung low to the ground like crouched animals. The willow tree stood still now, the swing unmoving. Elias walked toward row 7 with his usual deliberate pace. He wasn't in a hurry. He never hurried. The grass near plot 43 was undisturbed. No footprints, no markings, but he didn't need to see signs to know that something had changed. It wasn't just Elsie anymore. There was a new presence in the graveyard, and it wanted a name. Elias returned to the cottage and flipped back through several pages of the diary, scanning entries from previous years. October 15th, October 16th. Always the same pattern, the fog, the knocking the girl. Always her. But never before had there been a voice. Never before a demand. He turned to a fresh page and began to write. October 16th dawn. Door untouched but handle cold. Voice last night male. Claimed I had taken a name. I have not spoken hers aloud. Only in ink. Never aloud. It knows I wrote it. That's enough. He paused. The nib scratched the paper as he hesitated, then underlined the final sentence. A memory stirred. Something from years ago. When he first took the job, the townspeople gave him a box of old cemetery records, births, deaths, plots, a few handwritten notes from the former caretaker. Most of it was moldy and illegible, but he remembered one phrase written in thick black pencil on the inside flap of a ledger. Names root the dead to the soil. Write them at your own peril. He hadn't believed it then, but belief had very little to do with truth out here. The wind changed again around midday, though the trees remained still. It was the kind of shift that one felt behind the ears or at the base of the spine. Not cold, not warm, just unnatural. Elias stood at the chapel ruins by the north wall of the graveyard. Nothing remained of the old building except its stone arch and a few half-buried steps leading to a foundation choked with moss and ivy. He hadn't been here in weeks. He didn't like coming, but the voice had come from that direction last night. And now there was a trail, not footprints, but pressed grass, a line through the overgrowth. Something or someone had walked here while he slept. The trail stopped at the edge of the chapel's foundation, at a cracked slab that jutted like a broken tooth from the ground. Elias knelt, brushed away the dirt. There were letters carved into the stone nearly worn smooth. Only a few remained legible. Ewis Orne, his own name. Lewis Thorne, his father. Elias had never known where he was buried. His mother never said. He stared at the stone, unsure if he was more surprised that the grave existed or that it had called to him. Back at the cottage, the diary waited with its blank page open. Elias's pen hovered longer than usual. His thoughts weren't as steady. His pulse a bit quicker. His father had died before Elias turned 10. No funeral. No gravestone, at least that's what he was told. He remembered almost nothing of the man except for a voice. Harsh, cold, distant. He'd never once imagined him buried in this graveyard. He began to write. October 16th, 3:24 p.m. Found a grave at Chapel Edge. Stone broken, weathered, barely legible. Name reads Ewis Orne, my father. I did not bury him. I did not write him into this place. Someone else did. He sat back in the chair and stared at the page. The air had gone still again. Even the birds had ceased their rustling. He rose, stepped outside once more, and looked toward the trees beyond the gate. A figure stood there, tall, thin, in a black coat, motionless, no face visible, no breath in the air, just a silhouette. Elias didn't move, didn't call out. He waited, but the figure didn't. It turned and vanished into the fog. That night, the candle burned lower than usual. It dripped wax in slow tears onto the wood as Elias sat in silence. The diary lay closed now for the first time in years. He couldn't bring himself to open it again. Not tonight. The name had been written. The presence had come. And still he didn't know why, or what it wanted. But it knew him, and it was not finished. The swing creaked once outside. A single long groan, then silence. And in the darkness beyond the window, something whispered. Not in words, not in breath, but in memory. Something old, something buried. The whisper did not stop. It didn't rise or fall. It didn't waver. It was not a sound in the way one hears footsteps or wind through trees, but a sensation, a steady thread pulling taut across Elias's thoughts, like someone speaking not to him, but through him. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting palm down on the table, the candle nothing but a trembling stub. The flame leaned eastward, casting a long shadow behind him that seemed to stretch against the wall like it wanted to reach further than it should. The whisper threaded deeper into his ears, and with it came a single word. Return. Elias blinked. Once. Slowly. Not since his early years at the cemetery had anything spoken directly to him. Not the girl, not the shifting things in the mist. They moved, they watched, they hinted, but this was clear, commanding, and it carried something colder than malice recognition. Morning arrived reluctantly. Gray clouds turned the sky a dull pewter, and the light bled slowly across the field of stones. The birds remained absent. Elias stepped outside with his coat buttoned to the neck and the diary in one hand. His other hand clutched a small leather pouch, a mixture of salt grave dust and dried hemlock. A blend meant not to banish, but to bind. He walked toward the chapel. The ground seemed different beneath his boots, soft, not wet, like something had been dug and filled again in secret. When he reached the broken slab bearing his father's name, he stood over it in silence. The grave felt shallow, disturbed. He knelt and scattered a thin ring of the powder mixture around the stone. Not out of ritual, out of memory. Something he had read once long ago in the former gravekeeper's scrawl. If you can't bury what calls you, bind it where it waits. He stood up, brushing his hands clean. The wind held its breath, and then he heard it again, this time from below. A knocking, 3 slow thuds, as if someone beneath the soil wanted out. Elias did not react. He did not answer. Instead, he returned to the cottage. The diary waited where he left it, and the page opened without resistance. He wrote with a steadier hand than he expected. October 17th. It spoke. Clearly, word return. Chapel grave disturbed. Shallow depth. Knocked from below. Rebound with blend. This is not a haunting. This is a calling. He paused. Let the sentence sit, then added, I fear I'm not the only one being called. That night, the knocking returned, not beneath the chapel, but closer. From the earth behind the cottage, it started just past midnight. Soft, infrequent, like an animal's restless pacing underground. Elias remained seated, candle-lit eyes trained on the window that looked out over the rear path. Then at exactly 12:31 a.m. a bell rang. A small rusted bell that hung above the rear gate, untouched for decades. It shouldn't have rung. No wind, no birds, nothing to move it. Elias didn't rise. He simply opened the diary again and began to write. 12:31 a.m., the bell, rear gate. Something has crossed the line. He laid the pen down, closed the book, then stood. He moved not to the door, but to the wooden chest beneath his bed. Inside it lay 3 items: a lantern, a spade, and a folded cloth, marked with sigils he did not remember learning how to write. He took only the lantern. Tonight he would walk the graveyard without a map. The fog returned thick and low, curling around his ankles as he stepped past the front gate. He did not light the lantern, but carried it unlit, a familiar weight. The moon offered no aid, smothered by layers of cloud and distance, and yet Elias saw clearly. Shapes stood where they shouldn't. Shadows loomed longer than their sources. Trees bent as if leaning closer to listen. As he passed row 7, he paused. Elsie's grave remained undisturbed, but the willow behind her had changed. Its bark peeled open in a narrow vertical slit near the base, just wide enough for a small body to slip through. He said nothing. He did not approach. He continued on. When he reached the rear gate, the bell was still swaying gently. The chain rusted, unmoved by years, yet now shifting like something had brushed it. Elias stood beside it, unmoving until the swing settled. Then he turned and saw her, not the girl, a woman. Standing beyond the perimeter fence, face pale and gaunt, wrapped in a shroud of white cloth that moved despite the stillness of air. Her eyes were hollow, not black, not empty, but filled with the impression of eyes like bruises on porcelain. She did not step forward. She did not speak. She simply raised her hand and pointed. To the chapel, to the broken grave, to him. Elias nodded once and walked back without looking over his shoulder. Back in the cottage, the diary lay open as if waiting. He wrote with care. October 18th, woman at the fence. Older. Not Elsie. No movement, no sound. Pointed toward chapel. Not a warning, a command. I will return there tomorrow. Not alone. He tapped the pen gently against the paper, then folded a page from the back one he hadn't touched in years. On it was a name, not his own, but someone he'd been saving, just in case. The time for just in case had come. The name on the folded page was written in red ink, underlined once and circled faintly in pencil. A woman's name, Marla Gren. Elias had not spoken to her in 17 years. She had once been a midwife before she began speaking in riddles no one understood. Before the town called her hag-seer lost. Before she left and retreated into the hills beyond the cemetery's eastern rise. But Elias remembered what she said to him the last time they met. He'd been young, still unsure in his post, still afraid of knocking sounds and rustling trees. She'd watched him quietly as he swept leaves from a crypt door, and then murmured, "When the soil calls your name back to itself, don't answer alone." She'd handed him a slip of paper folded into the shape of a lily. Inside was her name. She told him to use it only after the voice had found its echo. He hadn't known what she meant then. He did now. That morning, Elias packed a small satchel. Just tea leaves, a tin flask, a compass that didn't point north, and the diary. The sky above remained colorless, as if drained. Even the mist felt drier, as though tired from its long hauntings. He didn't leave a note. He knew if he didn't return, no one would come looking. The townsfolk spoke of the graveyard like one speaks of illness, low brief, and only when needed. He walked the outer trail past the rear gate and into the thicket beyond the perimeter fence. The trees here grew too close, their roots curled like fingers around old stones no one had ever marked. He followed no path. There wasn't one, but the compass spun briefly, then stopped, pointed east. He followed. It took an hour to reach her place. A slanted shack built into the base of a hill wrapped in moss and thorn bush. Smoke curled from the chimney in thin, trembling strands. He knocked once, twice. The door creaked inward without invitation, and Marla was already sitting at the table. Her hair had grayed to the color of snowmelt, her hands gnarled and still. But her eyes, those strange, storm-colored eyes, were the same. She did not greet him. She merely said, "He spoke, didn't he?" Elias nodded once. She didn't ask which he. She didn't need to. She poured tea. The kettle had already been whistling before he arrived. As if she knew he'd come, they drank in silence for a time. Then Elias opened the diary and slid it toward her pages, fanned open to the latest entries. She didn't read it. She only placed her palm on the pages and closed her eyes. A tremor passed through her. She inhaled sharply, then spoke. "He's not in the grave, not fully. You bound him too late." Elias's mouth thinned. "Is he alive?" she finished for him. "No, not by your meaning." "But he lingers." "Why now?" Elias asked. "Why return?" "Because you've stayed too long," she said, opening her eyes. "Long enough that the roots know your name better than you do." She leaned forward. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He's not trying to break through the soil. He's trying to pull you under it." She gave him 3 items, a bundle of lavender wrapped in ash cloth, a key with no teeth, and a silver mirror the size of a locket. "Put the lavender beneath the chapel stone. Place the mirror face down atop it, and keep the key." "For what?" Elias asked. "For the thing inside you that might try to open what should remain shut." She said no more. He left before the sun fell. As he passed back into the cemetery, the mist began to rise again, unseasonal, swift curling at his legs like hungry smoke, and with it a sound, not whispering, breathing, his breath, but not from his lungs, from something imitating him. That night, he did not write in the diary. He simply placed it open by the candle and waited. The knock never came. The bell remained still. But when he looked into the window pane, his reflection wasn't still. It blinked before he did, and then it smiled, just barely, just wrong enough. He did not look again. Before dawn, Elias walked to the chapel. The ground around his father's grave was soft again. Not fresh dug, but freshly unsettled, like something had writhed just beneath the surface. He kneeled, placed the lavender under the slab, pressed the silver mirror on top, and whispered nothing. No words, no names, just silence. The air shuddered. Not a gust, just a tremble like a string pulled tight between worlds. Then the earth settled. When he returned to the cottage, the diary had a new page open. He hadn't left it that way, and on it in writing not his own were 6 words. "The soil remembers its own blood." He stared for a long time, then slowly turned the page back and picked up the pen. He didn't write about the soil, not yet. Instead, Elias simply wrote the date slow and methodical. October 19th. The pen hovered above the rest of the page, but no words followed. For once, he felt the pressure of writing as something alien, something heavy. The act that had always grounded him now felt like it was watching him back. He closed the diary, blew out the candle, and sat in silence. Outside, the air was unnaturally still. There were no footsteps along the gravel paths, no crows shifting in the trees. Even the distant hum of insects had vanished. The graveyard held its breath. At first, Elias thought it was his imagination, some trick of the silence or the growing weight in his chest. But when he stood by the window, he saw it plainly. The graves were breathing, not literally, not rising and falling. But something within the soil pulsed very gently, very slowly, like pressure moving beneath the skin of the earth. It began in row 7, then moved outward in a wide, invisible ripple, as though something had stirred below, and the ground itself recoiled in response. Elias closed the curtain. By mid-morning, the fog had burned away, and sunlight spilled coldly across the headstones. He walked his usual patrol, taking measured steps, careful not to disturb what had clearly shifted during the night. When he passed the chapel, he paused beside the cracked slab. The silver mirror was still there, still face down. But the lavender, gone, not scattered, not wilted, gone, as if it had never been. He knelt and placed his hand on the stone. Cold as ice, colder than anything above ground had a right to be. He didn't linger. He turned back toward the cottage, but halfway down the path he saw something new. A single piece of paper had been placed atop a grave near the west wall, plot 92. A grave that had always remained untouched, forgotten, bearing no name and no dates. The paper was heavy, creased, and yellowed. Folded 3 times, he picked it up. Inside, in delicate handwriting, were only 2 words: say nothing. Back at the cottage, he placed the note beside the diary, but didn't open the book. Something about the message disturbed him more than the presence that now clung to the graveyard like mold. Say nothing. It wasn't a warning. It was an instruction. And Elias, for all his years of writing, began to understand that perhaps it wasn't the speaking of names that held power. Perhaps it was the recording. The act of keeping memory on the page. The written word as a tether. He stared at the diary. What had he bound by recording it? What had he invited just by acknowledging its form? The presence that had once merely circled the cottage now seemed embedded in the very grain of the wood, the pages of his book, the breath he drew. That night he did not light the candle. He left the diary shut and sat, hands clasped in complete darkness. Outside, the swing moved, slowly, without sound. A soft knock came not at the door, but at the wall again, the same place it had knocked the first time. 3 slow taps. And then, "You wrote me down." The voice was familiar, but twisted, cracked like old glass. Elias remained still. He did not answer. He did not move. The voice came again, closer, just behind the wood. "You made me reel." He woke just before dawn, slumped at the table. At some point he had fallen asleep, but he didn't remember dreaming. The room smelled faintly of ash and loam. The diary was open again. The page was blank until before his eyes ink began to appear on the paper. As if an invisible hand wrote from within the grain of the page. It formed slowly, deliberately. "You will forget your voice. You will forget your name. And still, you will write." Elias reached for the pen, but his hand hesitated. There was an ache in his wrist, deep and hollow. And for a moment, the pen did not feel like his own, as if something else had guided it all along. He stood, pushed the chair back, left the diary open, and stepped outside into the chill of early light. He did not walk toward the chapel. He walked past it, into the far corner of the cemetery, toward a small shed no longer used where the oldest records were stored. He hadn't entered this place in over a decade. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and the weight of forgotten names. Old ledgers stacked like bones, paper turning to dust at the edges. He pulled the oldest volume from the bottom shelf, a register from the cemetery's founding years. He turned to the back pages where the writing grew strange. Symbols, diagrams, names with lines through them, and then a list of gravekeepers. Only 3 were marked. each with a date of arrival, none with a departure. He looked at the third name, Elias Thorne, but the ink was wrong. It was written in the same tight looping script as the diary, and the date listed was before his birth. He closed the book. His hands trembled now, not from fear but from realization. He had not inherited the job. He had been written into it, and the diary had been waiting long before he arrived. He walked back slowly. The fog curled low again. The gravestones leaned in strange angles as though observing. He passed Elsie's grave. The swing moved gently, but she was not there. No figure, no song, only silence, and that same pressure beneath the soil, waiting, not to rise, but to drag down. The cottage door creaked slightly when Elias returned, though the air outside had been calm. It no longer surprised him when the place breathed with its own rhythms. The structure itself had become part of the graveyard, absorbed, weathered, possibly even aware. He stepped inside and paused. The diary was no longer on the table. His breath caught not out of fear, but a deep hollow ache that pressed in the back of his chest. He hadn't moved it, and no one else had entered. Yet there it was, now placed neatly on the bed, open to a page written in fresh ink. He didn't need to read it. He already knew what it would say. Still his eyes were drawn to the page. You are the fourth, but the first to last this long. The soil is tired of waiting. Elias sat down slowly beside the book. The ink shimmered faintly, not with moisture, but with a kind of dim heat, as if the page itself were alive. The diary had never been just a record. It was a chain. Midday brought no sunlight, just a dim grayness that pressed against the windows. Elias boiled water, the hiss of the kettle grounding him for a few quiet moments. When he turned from the stove, he caught his reflection again, this time in the kettle lid. His reflection blinked with him. No delay, but it smiled, a slow, knowing smile. Elias did not return the expression. He poured his tea, placed the kettle back, and sat at the table once more. The diary now lay shut. He did not open it. Instead, he retrieved something from the bottom drawer, a second journal, one he hadn't touched in over 20 years. It was bound in worn red leather, smaller and entirely blank. He had always meant to use it if things ever changed. If the graveyard became too much. If he needed a place to write outside the other. Now he wasn't sure if it would matter. Still, he uncapped the pen, placed its tip gently against the first page, and wrote, If I forget myself, if my name no longer feels like mine, let this hold the truth. He stopped, closed it, slid it into his coat pocket, and went to visit his father. The grave looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. The slab remained in place. The silver mirror still lay face down atop the stone. Yet the air here had grown dense, the kind of density that made your ears ring and your thoughts stutter. Elias stood quietly, then crouched beside the grave. He pressed 2 fingers to the stone, cold still. But the moment his skin touched the surface, he saw something, not in the world around him, in his mind. A hallway, dark, earthen, with walls of packed soil and tangled roots like veins, and at the end of it a door, wooden, rotten, but pulsing, like it was breathing. A voice echoed in that dark corridor, soft but filled with gravel and spite. You wrote me down. Now write me out. He pulled his hand away. His heart was racing. That night the knocking returned. But it came not from the walls, not from the door. It came from under the floor. A slow dragging sound, wood bending ever so slightly beneath weight that should not exist. The candle flickered, the air grew stale, and the diary opened by itself. The pages fluttered faster and faster, then stopped. A single phrase now sprawled across both pages. The fourth will be buried in ink. Elias stood, his hands clenched at his sides. He wanted to scream, but there was no voice left in him for rage. He grabbed the diary and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a wave. The gravestones leaned more now, as if bending toward him. The mist parted before him as he marched. He returned to the chapel, and without hesitation, he hurled the diary into the grave. It landed with a dull, heavy thud, and the air shifted. All around him, the fog retracted. The pressure released. The earth no longer trembled. Elias exhaled, but the relief was short-lived. As he turned to leave, the wind picked up, and with it a sound of pages flipping. He looked back. The diary had opened again. without hands, without wind. And now, the silver mirror reflected not sky, but eyes, his father's eyes, looking back from beneath the earth, and the words written beneath the slab. Too late. Elias stepped back. The ground cracked, just slightly, and from below a voice whispered, "You forgot one rule. Never stop writing." The ground did not collapse. It did not open with dramatic violence or split into some yawning pit like in the stories. No. It cracked with an almost polite restraint, just a hairline fracture running through the corner of the chapel slab, no wider than the width of a fingernail. But the sound it made as it splintered was wrong. It wasn't the dull crack of stone meeting pressure. It was softer, wetter, like bone breaking beneath flesh. Elias froze, staring at the fracture. The mirror remained on top of the grave undisturbed, and yet somehow it seemed deeper now, its surface darker, the reflection within, no longer catching sky or candlelight, but something else. Something distant, moving, shifting slowly in rhythm, breathing. He took a half step back, the cold pressing harder against his chest, as if the air itself had thickened. The mist at his feet had begun to circle, not rise, coiling slowly tightly in precise rings around the chapel ruins, like a predator encircling prey. His eyes flicked to the diary still lying open in the shallow pit above the grave. The pages flipped again, this time sluggishly, like they were being turned by water, not wind. One after another, until they stopped. The same sentence had been written dozens of times across the pages in identical slanting script. "He will not leave until you take his place." Over and over, page after page. The repetition felt not like insistence, but inevitability. Like a verdict, Elias could feel the pull in his chest now, a slow ache, like a string winding tighter from inside his sternum down into the soil. Something was tethered between him and the grave beneath, and each second that passed made the thread stronger, heavier. He wanted to move, but his legs remained still, not paralyzed, obedient, like they were waiting for permission that wouldn't come from him. He clenched his fists until his nails pressed crescent moons into his palms, forcing a breath through gritted teeth. "No," he said aloud. The word dropped into the mist like a pebble into deep water, swallowed, gone without echo. Still saying it felt right, felt true. Something stirred inside the grave. Not a shape, not a form, but a presence slow and heavy like oil sinking through cloth. It pressed against the edges of its confinement, not aggressively, but with dreadful certainty, as if it knew that resistance was pointless. It would get out. All things sink eventually. All names decay into the soil. He knelt beside the grave with trembling hands and snatched up the mirror. Its surface had gone black, opaque, and pulsing faintly, as if reflecting not light, but heartbeat. For a split second, he saw his own face in the reflection, but it was wrong too. Still, too smooth. His features looked softened, erased slightly at the edges, like an unfinished painting. It smiled at him, and then it blinked. With a jolt, Elias dropped the mirror. It landed face down as before, but the illusion or truth had burned into his memory. The image of himself, not quite himself. That version had no lines on his forehead, no scars along his jaw. It was not younger, just emptier, as if it had never lived a life, only observed one from the other side of the page. The diary had stopped flipping. It now lay closed, completely shut, and on the front cover something new had been etched deeply, freshly, the edges still flaking stone-colored powder. It was not a word. It was a single symbol, a circle intersected by 3 diagonal slashes. Elias did not recognize it, not in a conscious sense, but every nerve in his body recoiled at the sight of it. Whatever it meant, it had no name in his tongue, He reached down and grabbed the diary. The leather was ice cold to the touch, and for a moment it resisted his grip, like the weight of it extended into something deeper than its physical form. When he pulled it free, the ground beneath the grave exhaled. The mist rippled outward in a wide ring, brushing against the tombstones and stirring up thin trails of dust. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang once, just once, and then silence fell like a curtain. Heavy, total. Elias did not return to the cottage immediately. He walked the perimeter of the cemetery, first moving along paths that he had memorized decades ago, checking the lanterns even though none had been lit. The light was fading fast now, not with the sun's descent, but something else, some dimming in the sky itself, like dusk without warning. By the time he reached the eastern edge of the grounds where the stones were oldest and the soil cracked like dried skin, he felt the pull again, the thread from his chest tugging not just downward now, but outward, toward the boundaries. He turned toward the fence. Beyond the rusted iron rails, just past the bent old tree where the owls used to nest, stood Marla. She had not moved since he'd left her shack. Her shawl clung to her, as if wet, though there had been no rain. Her hands were tucked into her sleeves. She did not wave, did not call to him, but her eyes met his across the distance, and she shook her head, just once, slow, final. Elias raised the diary. Her eyes flicked to it, then back to him. Her lips parted, and though no sound carried across the dead air, he understood. Not with his ears, with his memory, with whatever part of himself still remembered being just a man, a caretaker, and not whatever it was he was becoming. She said, "You can't carry it forever." The diary pulsed in his hands. He turned back toward the cottage, and the wind began to rise. The wind did not howl or whistle, it groaned, a low stretched moan that seemed to leak from the very bones of the trees and the cracks in the stone. It followed Elias as he walked back to the cottage, pushing gently at his back, herding him like cattle towards something waiting inside. The diary throbbed with each step he took, not violently, but rhythmically, like a second heartbeat pressed against his palm. His fingers itched to open it to see what it had written while he was gone, but he didn't dare. Not out here. Not under the sky, which had turned the color of tarnished silver. The cemetery, for all its stillness, no longer felt dead. It felt aware, observing, and worse, expectant. When he reached the cottage, he paused at the door, staring at the threshold. The salt line had vanished, not scattered, not brushed away by wind or footsteps, simply gone, as though the wood had swallowed it or time had erased it. Elias stood motionless, the diary heavy in his grip. He knew instinctively that whatever protection the threshold had once offered, it no longer held sway. But he also knew there was no point in standing outside like prey. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room greeted him with an unnatural silence. Not peaceful, suffocating. The kind of silence that makes you question your own breath, makes you wonder if the walls have moved just slightly when you weren't looking. The candle stub was gone. In its place on the table was the red journal, the blank one he had placed in his coat pocket. But it was no longer blank. One word had been etched into the first page with a force that had cut into the paper nearly through to the cover. It read, "Stay." Elias set the black diary beside it, then sat. The chair groaned under his weight, the wood seeming to shift slightly under him, as if resisting his presence. He stared at the two books for a long while, his eyes flicking between them. One, a journal of resistance. The other, a record of submission. The room around him seemed to pulse faintly, shadows, thickening in corners, lines along the walls curving ever so slightly inward. He opened the black diary slowly, letting the pages breathe. They fell open without his hand guiding them, and written in a dark ink he didn't recognize, neither fountain nor blood, was a single phrase, repeated over several lines. When you stop writing, it begins. He flipped to the next page. A blank space, but the paper twitched faintly, as if waiting. He picked up the pen and hovered over the surface. Something within him recoiled, not out of fear, but instinct. The same instinct that tells a creature the tide is turning, or that an earthquake is coming long before the ground shakes. Writing meant continuation. Writing meant surrender. But not writing. Not writing might mean replacement. He wrote finally in a tight, reluctant scrawl, October 20th. I have returned. The line is gone. The mirror holds for now. Marla saw me. She said I cannot carry it forever. The book wrote to me again. Not just in words, but in weight. It feels hungrier. If I am the fourth, I must learn why they failed. As he finished the sentence, something shifted in the room. A gust of wind pressed against the outer walls, then ceased immediately. Elias stood the diary still open and listened. No knock, no bell. But the quiet was different now, not empty, full of something unseen. He moved to the far corner of the room where the trapdoor lay beneath a dusty rug, barely more than a plank with rusted hinges leading to a shallow root cellar. He hadn't opened it in years, not since the noises started coming from beneath. But the tug in his chest returned like a hook had snagged the center of his spine and was pulling him backward, downward, inward. He set the diary aside, grabbed the lantern from the wall, and lit it slowly with a match that sputtered once before catching. The flame hissed in the stale air, casting shadows along the wooden slats as he peeled back the rug and stared at the handle. The floor here was cold. So much colder than it should have been. He grasped the ring and pulled. The trapdoor resisted. The wood groaned, strained, then gave way with a snap of old rot and rust. The darkness below greeted him with a gust of damp air that reeked of loam mildew, and something sharper, like iron left to rust in blood. The steps descended into black, uneven, and narrow. He held the lantern forward and began to climb down. Each step creaked. Each inch downward seemed to press against his ears. The air was thick, too thick. His chest tightened not from fear, but from pressure, like the space wasn't meant to accommodate breathing things. He reached the bottom 6 steps, maybe 7, and stood on soil. The cellar was small, just wide enough to turn around. Root-veined walls pressed close, dripping faintly in places where moisture gathered. But it was not the walls or the smell that stopped him cold. It was the chair, wooden, unpainted, facing the far wall, and on it sat a skeleton perfectly upright, dressed in an old gravekeeper's coat identical to Elias's own. The bones were yellowed but undisturbed, and on the floor beside the chair, leaning against one leg, was a book. Another diary. He stepped forward slowly, lantern held high, and knelt beside the bones. The coat was still intact barely. A badge on the breast pocket rusted nearly unreadable. But the name, C. Yarrow. The third, Elias reached for the diary. His hands trembled as he opened the brittle leather cover. Inside the first page had a single sentence written in an unfamiliar hand. I wrote until I was hollow. He turned to the next page, then the next. Each line filled with the same sentence over and over until the ink grew fainter, the hand weaker, the spacing uneven. Finally, the entries stopped, not with a farewell, not with a plea, just blank pages. Elias stood slowly backing away from the chair, his lantern shaking faintly. The pressure in the air grew heavier again. The walls seemed closer, and from the top of the stairs, he heard the faintest sound pages turning. The black diary, upstairs, turning itself again. But the sound was deeper now. Wetter. And when he looked toward the light at the top of the steps, it was no longer alone. A shadow passed between the stair slats. Not walking, crawling. Elias didn't move. His fingers tightened around the lantern handle, the flickering flame casting long, crooked shadows against the dirt walls of the cellar. He stared at the stairs, heart thudding, not from fear alone, but from something worse recognition. The shadow had no shape he could clearly define, no legs or arms, no face, but it had weight. The way it moved over the trapdoor opening, gliding more than crawling, was wrong. It didn't disturb the air. It didn't make a sound, but it touched the light, and the light recoiled. The glow at the top of the stairs dimmed slightly, as if whatever passed through it had drunk from it. He could feel the atmosphere pressing in, not just on his body, but on his self. That thin membrane between memory and surrender. There was a presence watching from above, no longer content to whisper from the floorboards or knock gently on walls. It had entered the room. It had moved through the house. And now it was waiting, not for him to come back up, but to choose. The diary in the cellar, the one marked with C. Yarrow, lay open again, as if it too had been disturbed by the passing thing above. Its pages trembled, though there was no draft. A corner lifted faintly, teasing the edge of the next page, asking him to continue reading. But Elias didn't touch it. Instead, his eyes drifted to the skeleton again. The coat had faded, the boots cracked with age, but the bone sat so still, so unnaturally poised, it felt like the man had not died in that chair. He had become the chair. Part of the structure now. A final post. A warning no one had ever come down to hear. Elias backed away slowly, his boots sinking into the damp earth with a muffled squelch. The lantern flame jerked violently for a moment, then steadied. He turned and climbed the stairs, each step louder than he expected. The air thickened around him like fog underwater. As he neared the top, the glow from the main room returned. But it was different. Brighter, but not warm. The light had gone cold, sterile, like the reflection of a flame in metal. And it didn't flicker. It pulsed. When he reached the top, he paused before emerging. The diary was open again, resting on the table like an obedient pet waiting for its master. The pages were still turning, one every few seconds, and on each one a single line appeared, as if written by invisible fingers. I will wear your skin of ink. Over and over. The words bled into the page, not from the surface, but through it, as if the book itself was sweating the words out from its pores. The red journal, the one Elias had meant to be his own, lay beside it, untouched, its single word still etched on the first page like a command burned into stone. Stay. Elias stepped fully into the room. The trapdoor behind him slid shut with a soft click. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. The house had accepted his return. For better or worse, he belonged to it now. He sat at the table, eyes fixed on the black diary as it continued its slow performance. He did not reach for the pen. Not yet. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out the red journal. He opened it to the second page and touched it with his thumb, pressing faintly, as if to test whether it would yield. And it did. The paper warmed beneath his skin, not like fire, like breath. And for the first time in weeks, he felt a choice beneath his fingers. He uncapped his pen and began to write. This is my book, my story. If I must become the fourth, let it be. By my hand, not yours. The air shifted again. The candle flame flared upward, then stilled. Across the room, the black diary stopped turning. Its pages snapped shut all at once, the sound sharp as a gunshot. Elias felt something pass through his chest in that moment, a chill, like a memory torn from the root. His mind flashed with images he couldn't place, a young boy crying behind a mausoleum, a mirror shattered underfoot, a woman whispering a name over and over while her hands bled into the soil. He stood suddenly aware of something behind him, not near, inside. A shadow nestled just behind his spine, curling along his ribs, waiting for his next move. He turned slowly, half expecting to see a reflection waiting in the window, or worse, nothing at all. But it was the room itself that had changed. The walls had darkened, not in color, but in texture. They looked less like timber and more like pages. Thousands of overlapping pages, all thin as skin, pulsing gently as though breathing. He took a step forward and saw ink running down one of them. Words formed and unformed, slurring into each other like water-washed letters. Some sentences were recognizable snippets from his own past journal entries. Others were unfamiliar, or perhaps not yet written. He reached out and touched the wall. It was warm, not pleasant, not comforting, but alive. His finger came away, stained with black, the ink sliding across his skin like oil. Then the voice returned, not outside, not behind the wall, from within. "You are not writing me," it said. "You are writing yourself into me." He staggered back, hand shaking the pen, falling to the floor with a clatter that echoed too long in the small space. The diary flared open again on the table unbidden. This time, it was not neat. The pages whipped violently, like a beast clawing through its own body. The lantern burst with a pop darkness flooding the corners of the room. The swing outside began to move. Fast, back and forth, and then knocking, but not from the door, not from the wall, from inside the diary, a rhythmic thump beneath the table, like something crawling against the underside of the desk, straining to push upward through the pages. Elias did not scream. He picked up the red journal, opened to the 3rd page, and began to write his name again and again and again, each time slightly different, each time slightly less himself, each time closer to whatever waited inside the black book. Elias didn't notice when the knocking stopped. Or perhaps it didn't stop so much as dissolve into the pulse of his blood, becoming indistinguishable from the rhythm in his ears, a steady, low thudding that came not from without, but from somewhere behind his eyes. He wrote his name again in the red journal, though. By now, it had begun to mutate, first in the shape of the letters, then in the way the pen moved across the paper. The E became angular, harsh, almost like a rune. The LS stretched unnaturally long, their vertical lines trailing off as if unwilling to stop. By the 5th repetition, it no longer looked like a name at all, but a shape, a loop, a tether, something unfinished and incomplete, reaching forward into pages yet unwritten. He stopped mid-stroke and stared at the ink, still wet, bleeding slightly at the edges of the paper. The room had gone silent again, but not in the way it had before. This was new. The silence wasn't an absence of sound. It was an absence of place. The air around him felt hollow, as if he had moved into a pocket between moments, a fold in time where everything around him was paused, and only the weight of his decisions remained in motion. He closed the red book, his fingertips trembling against the leather. Something in the texture had changed. It felt less like leather now, and more like skin. Not raw or gruesome, but disturbingly warm, pliable, as though the book itself was beginning to respond to his touch. He set it down gently, glancing at the black diary. It had gone still again, closed and inert, as if waiting for him to make the next move. The walls continued to pulse, not visibly, but perceptibly. He could feel it under his feet, a gentle flexing in the floorboards, as though the entire room had become a throat, and he was standing inside something holding its breath. He stood and moved toward the window, needing air that felt real, a view that wasn't twisted by the invisible contours of the Black Diary's influence. Outside, the cemetery had changed. It no longer looked like a place of rest. The gravestones leaned at angles that defied geometry. The trees had curled in on themselves like hunched figures, and the fog, thick and unmoving, had turned greenish-gray, like algae blooming over stagnant water. But it wasn't the landscape that stopped him cold. It was the movement. Dozens, no hundreds of faint silhouettes standing throughout the graveyard, unmoving, human in shape, pale, featureless, each one facing the cottage. They didn't sway or blink or breathe. They simply watched. Some stood beside known graves' names Elias could recall from decades of caretaking. Others stood in corners of the land where no one had ever been buried, but they all shared the same posture, still, expectant, like actors waiting for their cue. He turned from the window bile rising in his throat. This was no longer a haunting. This was a summons. The diary on the table opened again slowly this time, almost respectfully. The pages turned themselves with care until one blank sheet remained. The ink bled up from beneath the surface, forming a symbol Elias had never seen before. It resembled a doorway, not a traditional one, no hinges, no handle, just a rectangular outline, etched in concentric lines curling inward, as if the symbol itself was drawing him into it. Below it, the diary had written a new phrase: "The door remembers who built it." Elias sat lowering himself into the chair as if it had become part of a ritual. The room had darkened again, though no light had been extinguished. The darkness wasn't about illumination. It was about weight. The pressure of shadow, the density of what was pressing down from above. He touched the ink of the symbol. The moment his fingertip grazed the paper, the floor shook slightly. Not a quake, but a shudder, like something deep beneath the earth had stretched in its sleep. A distant groan echoed from under the foundation. The house held its breath. Then the front door creaked, not opened, not knocked upon, just acknowledged. Elias didn't look at it. He knew that if he did, he'd see it standing open even though it hadn't moved. Instead, he flipped the page in the red journal, uncapped the pen, and began to write a question. Who was the first? The answer appeared in the Black Diary, one line only, as if the page had been waiting for the question to be formed. The one who wrote the land into silence. He stared at the words, unsure if the answer meant anything. But something inside him shifted. A memory. A dream. No, a whisper from deeper within. Something ancestral. A place in his bloodline that predated language. His hands moved again. This time, he wrote in both books at once. His right hand guiding the red journal, his left scrawling across the black. He didn't understand how he was doing it. The words flowed without instruction. One hand wrote his thoughts, his fear, his resolve. The other wrote things he did not recognize, descriptions of things, buried rituals, unfinished voices still echoing beneath roots untouched for centuries. It went on for minutes, maybe hours. Time had detached itself completely now. The world outside the cottage no longer existed. There was only ink and paper and the slow, inevitable unraveling of what Elias had always believed to be his life. Finally, both hands stopped. The red journal contained a single complete sentence across an entire page written in his voice. If I stop, I am erased. The Black Diary held a different line, jagged and raw, as though it had been etched with nails instead of pen. If you continue, you become me. And then, without warning, the room changed again. Not visually, musically. A tone barely audible like the hum of a tuning fork filled the air. It vibrated in Elias's teeth under his tongue behind his eyes. It resonated with the ink, with the bones beneath the floor, with the mirror outside still pressed against the chapel grave. Something had begun, not outside, inside the writing. The hum intensified, not in volume, but in depth. It sank into Elias's body like cold water seeps into old stone, slow, total, inescapable. It seemed to come from the pages, but also from beneath the house, from the cracked soil outside, from the graves, where breath had long ago ceased, but names still pulsed faintly through the marrow of the earth. He gritted his teeth, but the vibration made them feel loose in his skull, as if the sound were trying to shake something out of him. Across the table, the black diary throbbed again, its cover flexing slightly with each pulse, like the skin of something breathing just under the surface. Elias gripped the edge of the table with both hands, his knuckles turning white. He forced himself to look down at the pages again. The symbol, the doorway, was still there, but it had changed. The concentric lines now formed spirals. The center warped into a pinprick of black, so deep it seemed to pull light into it. It was not just a drawing anymore. It was an opening. A chill ran through him. This was not metaphor. This was invitation, and he understood finally the true purpose of the diary. It had never been meant for memories or confessions. It was a key, a lock, a channel. Those who wrote in it didn't record. They participated. Their words weren't reflections, they were structures. Sentences laid down like bricks, thoughts arranged like steps. And when enough had been written, the door would open. He sat back, sweat prickling across his scalp despite the cold. His gaze flicked to the red journal, still inert, still obedient. But for how long? He flipped to a blank page, and after a moment of hesitation wrote, "I will not finish the door." The room shuddered. The hum dropped an octave. It was not a sound anymore. It was a presence. His breath caught in his throat as the floor beneath the table bowed upward. Just a little. The wood groaned. The rug shifted. A bulge in the center of the room like something swelling beneath the boards. He rose slowly, careful not to make sudden movements. The lantern was out the windows dark, but he could still see. Not with his eyes, but with the sense that he was being seen in return, as if the shadows themselves had eyes watching him, not with malice, but with the indifferent patience of something that had waited through centuries and would wait centuries more. He stepped back, the boards beneath his heels creaking with a wet softness. A crack split across the table where the diaries rested. Not loud, just a soft, splintering line that stretched from edge to edge like a crack in ice. The red book shifted slightly, sliding an inch toward the edge before settling again. Then came the voice. No longer external. No longer a whisper from behind walls or floorboards. This voice came from the black diary itself, not spoken aloud, but printed one word at a time across its open pages. "You've written too much to stop." Elias swallowed hard. His hands trembled as he backed toward the far wall. The floor's bulge had grown. The air now smelled of soil, of ink, of something long buried that had been waiting to be remembered. He knew that scent. It was the scent of writing, left unfinished sentences that had been interrupted, thoughts abandoned mid-stroke souls trapped in stories no one had ever finished. He'd seen it before. In the eyes of the second gravekeeper, in the cellar beneath the chapel where tools lay scattered around an empty chair and claw marks lined the walls. The black diary hadn't always been bound in leather. Once long ago it had been bound in names, bound in the intention of men like him, men who thought they were the authors of their own story, only to discover that the story had been writing them all along. He looked around the room, suddenly aware that nothing had truly changed. The furniture was as it always had been, the lantern in its place, the windows closed, but he had changed. His perception had been rewritten. The room was no longer a place of safety. It was a threshold, a vestibule, and he was no longer a man. He was a page. Outside, the silhouette still stood motionless among the graves. But now, one of them had moved. Just one. A tall figure, thin and stooped, had turned its head ever so slightly. Not toward the cottage, but toward the chapel. Elias felt the shift in his bones. The chapel was the origin point. It always had been. The grave marked Lewis Thorne had never been about legacy or bloodline. It was the anchor, the knot holding the threads of every diary entry, every buried thought, every unfinished sentence penned by every keeper who had ever stood where Elias stood now. And the mirror was no longer holding. He knew this the way one knows when something terrible is about to happen, not through logic, but through some inherited animal sense. The kind that makes you step back from a cliff before you realize how close your foot is to the edge. He grabbed the red journal, clutching it tightly against his chest like a relic, and moved to the door. The floor protested. The bulge now pushed visibly against the rug, lifting the legs of the table slightly. The black diary slid toward the edge, then stopped. Watching, waiting, wanting him to finish what the others could not. He stepped outside. The air bit at his skin with the sharpness of midnight frost, though the sky showed no stars. Just an endless, low-hanging cloud cover that glowed faintly from within, casting the world in shades of blue and gray. The wind had died. The trees were still, but he could feel movement beneath the soil with every step he took. The roots had begun to stir. As he passed row 7, the ground beside Elsie's grave seemed to sigh. A low exhalation that stirred the grass, lifted the swing, and made the headstone tremble, as if something beneath it had finally opened its eyes. He did not stop. At the chapel, the air was different, charged, the kind of silence that came before a scream. The mirror was gone. In its place, an open hole, narrow and black, descending into nothingness, and around it fresh footprints, his own, except he had never come this way since that night. The red journal warmed in his hand, and from the bottom of the hole came the unmistakable scratch of a pen dragging across a page. But there were no pages down there, unless one had just been opened. Elias stood at the edge of the grave, that no longer resembled a grave, the place where the cracked slab once marked the resting site of Lewis Thorne, now a gaping wound in the earth rounder than any coffin-shaped pit should be. Its sides unnaturally smooth as though not dug, but opened as though the soil itself had peeled back. The mirror was gone, not shattered or discarded, just absent, and in its place was that hole, a shaft of impossible blackness, so complete it seemed not merely unlit but immune to light. Even as he tilted the lantern forward, the flame licked downward into the void and found no surface to cling to. There was no echo, no bottom, just the faint sound of something moving beneath, far below, methodical and slow, the dry scratch of a pen across parchment, again and again, as if someone were recording each passing second in ink binding time itself to a page that had no end. He wanted to run. Not in panic, not with flailing steps, but in a calm, knowing way, the kind of retreat made by people who understand what it means when a door opens that was never meant to open, and a voice begins writing in your stead. But Elias knew there was no leaving this place. Not now. The thread had tightened too far. Whatever had begun beneath the chapel decades ago, centuries, maybe had reached its final page, and it was waiting for him to write the ending, or to become it. The red journal in his hands pulsed gently, almost reassuringly, its leather cover warm like flesh left out in the sun too long. He flipped it open. The previous entries remained the warnings, the names, the lines he'd scrawled under duress, but the next page was blank, and somehow brighter than paper should be in the dead of night. He felt the urge to write, not as compulsion, but as necessity, like his fingers would twitch and ache until they carved something down. His pen hovered above the page, then dropped a black bead of ink swelling at the tip before falling. He wrote, "I am not the fourth. I am the first to understand." The moment the final stroke curled into place, the earth beneath him groaned, not collapsing, but responding like a stomach digesting something heavy. He stepped back instinctively as the soil around the hole cracked in a perfect ring, the grave widening an inch, then two, as if adjusting to his presence. A hiss of warm air rushed up from the opening, not foul, but familiar, scented faintly with cedarwood old parchment and the metallic tang of fresh ink. He realized then what it was: the smell of an unwritten book, the scent of pages waiting to be filled. Then came the voices. Not many. Just one layered over itself 1,000 times like echoes in a deep canyon, or the sound of a choir where each singer is only slightly out of sync. It spoke in words Elias knew, but not in his language. It said, "You were never the keeper. You were the kept." He stepped back farther, but not out of fear. Understanding settled over him now, thick and heavy like fog rising from marshes at dawn. The diary, the black one, had never recorded his thoughts. It had shaped them. It had taught him how to remember only what it wanted, remembered how to forget, in places where forgetting left gaps for it to fill. Every page he had written, every careful line about footprints or grave shifts or whispers beneath the floorboards, had not been observation, but creation. He had not been documenting hauntings. He had been authoring them into being. And now the manuscript was near its end. The chapel behind him moaned as wind passed through the broken arch, though the night was still. The sky had dropped lower clouds, pressing unnaturally close to the treetops, casting everything in a dense bluish glow that made shadows retreat and refuse to form. In that light, Elias saw movement again, not from the graves this time, but from the path leading up the hill. Figures, 3 of them. They didn't walk. They glided, their feet never quite touching the ground, long coats fluttering despite the lack of breeze. Their faces were obscured not by distance, but by absence-blank ovals where features should be. Each carried something: the first, a lantern that held no flame; the second, a quill with no tip; the third, a stack of blank parchment pages curling as if already touched by time. Elias knew who they were: the first, the second, the third. They did not speak. They did not beckon. They simply stood at the chapel's edge, watching, their attention fixed not on him, but on the hole at his feet, as if measuring its depth or awaiting its next breath. He realized then that they had not failed in their roles. They had fulfilled them. Each had carried the burden to the point of collapse, then passed it on by allowing the book to choose again. He was not the 4th successor. He was the 4th chapter. The diary wanted its story to continue. He dropped to his knees, heart pounding, as he held the red journal open in one hand, the pen hovering in the other. His breath fogged the page. He knew that to stop writing now meant vanishing, not death, but erasure, an undoing so complete that no memory of him would remain in the house, the graves, or even the ink he had poured so much of himself into. But to continue meant becoming less of a man and more of a function, a scribe for something ancient, something buried, something that used memory as ink and grief as grammar. He flipped back to the last sentence he wrote: "I am not the 4th. I am the first to understand." He crossed out the word understand. He replaced it: "I am the first to refuse." The silence recoiled. The wind returned in a single burst, the trees groaning above. The black diary screamed not in sound, but in vibration, its pages fluttering violently back in the cottage, as if being torn from the binding by unseen hands. From the hole came a single drawn-out note, half breath, half scream, like an unwelcome name whispered for the last time. and then the sky blinked, just once. A ripple passed through the mist like a shockwave, and when it was gone, the three figures had vanished. So had the chapel, so had the hole. Elias sat alone on a patch of grass that felt newly laid soft and untrodden, as though it had never known the weight of footsteps or coffins or ink. In his hands the red journal had gone cold, and on its final page, written in someone else's hand, was a question. Do you wish to end the book or begin another? Elias sat motionless, the question staring up at him from the page with the patience of eternity. It did not glow or whisper or bleed. It simply waited, cleanly penned in sharp black ink that hadn't been there a moment ago. Do you wish to end the book or begin another? It was not a threat. It was not even a challenge. It was permission, an acknowledgement that he stood at a precipice, not just of story, but of structure, and whatever choice he made would not just affect his fate, but the very architecture of the place around him, the walls of the cottage, the roots beneath the graves, the shifting air above the soil. For a moment, he thought perhaps this was what the others had never reached. Not a conclusion, but choice. Maybe the first, the second, the third had never been offered the option, because they had never disobeyed, never pushed back hard enough to break the rhythm. Perhaps refusing was the key. Perhaps rebellion created pause, but even that thought felt premature. There were always costs. He stared at the question until his eyes began to water, and the words shimmered faintly in the growing damp of night. His fingers, stained with ink and dirt, hovered over the paper. The weight of the pen in his hand had grown heavier, though he couldn't tell whether it was from exhaustion or because it too had changed. Like the act of writing had filled it with the burden of memory, as if each word he'd ever committed to paper still echoed through its barrel, pressing outward. Behind him, the cemetery was still, not peaceful, listening. The fog had receded, but not lifted, lingering low like a veil drawn across a wake. The graves had ceased their breathless exhalations, and the silhouettes, if they still stood among the stones, had become indistinguishable from the night. Yet he knew with bone-deep certainty that the watching had not stopped. He could feel the tension, the subtle shift in the soil beneath him, the charged stillness of the trees. The land waited for his reply. He began to write, slowly, carefully. I do not wish to begin another. I do not wish to end. I wish to release. The air changed. Not temperature or scent, but gravity itself seemed to shift, as though the world tilted slightly on its axis, the balance of things altering by degrees only someone deeply connected to the pulse of the land could feel. Elias blinked against the sensation, the hairs on his arms standing upright. The journal did not respond at first, but the moment he set the pen down beside it, the ink lifted from the page, not evaporated, not smudged, but pulled, as if some unseen mouth beneath the page had inhaled the words, dragging them inward, letter by letter. The sentence faded, drawn away not just into the paper, but through it into whatever dimension or depth lay just beyond the parchment. And then the grass beneath him stirred. He looked down and saw it folding in on itself, blades curling toward a central point. The earth shifted subtly, and a small seam opened in the dirt like lips parting in sleep. From it rose not mist or hand or darkness, but a book, bound in red leather, identical to his own, but older, stained. Its corners frayed, the cover worn smooth by time and touch. The red was faded now to a deep maroon, almost black, and along the spine was a name he had never seen before, T. Whitcomb. He knelt, hand hovering above the book. The name struck something in him, not a memory, but a connection. Elsie, the grave in row 7. He had written her name dozens of times, documented the shifts in the grass, the singing, the knocking, but he had never asked who she was before. never wondered who had written her into the graveyard in the first place. He opened the book. It was filled with music, not notation, not lyrics, but the texture of melody captured in ink that bent and arced across the page in long, fluid lines. Some pages trembled as he touched them, humming faintly, like tuning forks struck at their core. Others wept thin rivulets of water from the corners, curling slightly as if the book were remembering a drowning. It was not a diary. It was a score. A symphony of grief and silence and interruption, each measure a moment of being seen and forgotten again. And in the center of the book was a single torn page. On it was written, Elsie was never buried. Elsie was recorded. Elias staggered backward, breath-catching. The grave. The name. The sightings. She had not haunted the graveyard. She was the graveyard. The first phrase of its unfinished melody. He flipped the page and found more handwriting, different, now rushed and uneven. They told me writing her name would give her peace. But writing gave her form. And form cannot rest. His mind reeled. All the times he'd written Elsie's name, described her, observed her movements, her presence, her voice in the wind. He had not been chronicling her passing. He had been feeding her continuation. And now he understood why the diary always compelled writing. Why it fought silence. It was not just a record, it was an engine. A mechanism by which souls could be structured and sustained, kept alive not by flesh, but by narrative. And now that he had refused to write further, the engine had no fuel. He looked toward the chapel and saw it flicker just once like a mirage. Then again, as if it were unraveling, caught between pages, trying to decide whether it had ever been real in the first place. He turned back to the red book. On the last page, new ink had appeared. Release her. Write the last word. His hand moved without thought. He flipped open the black diary still tucked beneath his arm. The symbol of the door was gone. In its place, one empty page, blank and waiting. He wrote a single word. He didn't plan it. He simply knew it. Silence. The earth responded instantly. The grave stilled. The swing stopped. The pressure vanished from his chest. The chapel disappeared, and in the sky, for the first time in what might have been centuries, stars blinked through the thinning clouds. The black diary crumbled to ash in his hands, and the red one closed itself. Elias sat in the grass, staring at the soil where the book had emerged. The seam had closed. The grass straightened. The land exhaled, and from the far edge of the cemetery, just once, a child's voice whispered, not sorrowful, not frightened, grateful. The voice faded almost as soon as it came, like a ripple dying out, before it could reach the edge of a still pond. And in the quiet that followed, Elias remained seated, not out of exhaustion, but from something far more rare peace. Not the false calm that had blanketed the graveyard in those long nights before the knocking began, but a genuine stillness, as if the very soil beneath him had relaxed, as if the names etched into stone no longer twisted beneath their weight. For the first time in decades, the earth felt settled. It felt rested. He didn't move for several minutes. There was no urge to. The pressure that had driven every footstep, every ink stroke, every breath during those sleepless nights was gone, and its absence left a kind of clarity. Not numbness, stillness. He looked down at the red journal in his lap. Its cover no longer pulsed, no longer felt like something living. It had cooled completely. The spine rested flat, and there was no hum within it now, no whisper of a presence waiting behind the pages. He opened it with one hand and was met with only what he himself had written. No additions, no bleed-throughs from other voices, no corrections by unseen hands. It was his. At last, he flipped to the first page and reread the earliest lines, those uncertain beginnings when the ink trembled with hesitation and doubt. then to the middle, when the handwriting had grown rushed, scared bent beneath the weight of things not entirely his, and finally to the end, clean, simple strokes, written in a hand no longer fearful, but resigned, then freed. He closed the journal and slid it into the inside pocket of his coat. Behind him, the cemetery began to breathe again, but differently. Trees groaned with natural wind, not with the pressure of watching eyes. Stones stood crooked as they always had, but now they held their crookedness without menace, without suggestion. The swing beneath the willow tree swayed gently once, as if catching the tail end of a breeze rather than echoing some long-silenced lullaby. He turned and began walking, not away from the chapel ruins which had completely vanished now without trace, not even disturbed grass or broken roots to suggest anything had ever been buried there, but toward the center of the cemetery, toward the cottage. The walk felt longer than usual, not because the path had changed, but because the land was now honest. Whatever distortions the diary had imposed on space and time had evaporated, leaving only true distances. He could feel the coolness of the soil beneath his boots, hear the crunch of gravel with each step, smell the faint sweetness of moss growing on the shaded side of older tombstones. These were familiar sensations, small but grounding, and he realized just how long it had been since he'd felt them clearly. The ink, the diary, the presence. They had dulled the edges of reality. They had filtered his senses through a lens of obligation and dread. But now, the lens had been shattered. The cottage stood exactly as it always had, leaning slightly to the left, its roof patched with moss, one shutter loose on the northern window. He stepped inside and was met with the warm, musty scent of home old wood burnt candle wax, and the faint trace of the herbs he kept bundled above the hearth. The black diary was gone, not destroyed in some dramatic flare, not reduced to ash, just gone, as if the space it occupied had never existed. He stepped forward and ran a hand across the table where it once lay. The wood was smooth, no trace of ink, no pressure marks from pages pressed too hard, no ghost of the story it once contained. Elias stood in the center of the room and listened. Silence, real silence. No breathing beneath the floorboards, no scratching in the walls, no creak of unseen footsteps pressing gently on old wood. Just the stillness of night. He took a deep breath, deeper than he'd taken in years, and sat down in the chair by the window. Outside, the sky had continued to clear. Stars glimmered cold and sharp like eyes that watched without judgment, without hunger. He remembered sitting here once years ago when he first took the job, before the diary had fully revealed itself, before he knew what it meant to carry someone else's story in your hands, what it meant to bind yourself to ink that didn't belong to you. Back then, he had felt hopeful, nervous, a little foolish even. He had thought keeping a journal would give structure to the quiet. He had thought writing would keep him sane, and yet it had been writing that almost unmade him. He looked around the room now and saw the signs of his life scattered across every surface, the chipped mug, the worn blanket, the map of burial plots pinned crookedly to the far wall. These were not pieces of a man trapped in a haunted routine. They were pieces of a man returning to himself. For the first time in his long tenure, Elias allowed himself to close his eyes before the candle was extinguished. He didn't need to patrol the graves. He didn't need to listen for sounds beneath the bed. He didn't need to write. The red journal sat quiet in his pocket, and he knew it would remain so until he chose to open it. Time passed. Hours. Maybe only minutes. Sleep approached without resistance. Not the troubled, half-lucid dozing of the past, but real sleep, the kind that carries a man gently through the night without asking him to bear witness to what stirs outside. But just before sleep took him, something brushed against the edge of his mind, a thought, barely formed, a single possibility rising from the void, like a bubble rising to the surface. The diary had crumbled. The story had ended. But what if someone, somewhere, picked up a pen? Not him. Someone else. What if another gravekeeper began to write? And what if the earth, remembering what ink had once done, listened again? The stars blinked. The silence deepened, and Elias finally let go. Morning came slow and pale. A cold light pressing gently against the window panes, not quite eager enough to warm the walls, but persistent enough to peel back the long darkness of night. Elias woke with a stillness in his bones, the kind of quiet that doesn't come from rest alone, but from resolution. The chair beneath him creaked slightly as he stirred, and for a fleeting moment he expected to feel the familiar weight of dread sitting with him in the room, the silent presence that had shadowed every dawn before this one, the whispering tension that used to slip beneath the cracks of his thoughts the moment he opened his eyes. But it wasn't there. There was no sound beneath the floorboards, no eyes watching from the corners, no quivering of the mirror on the wall. The house, like the land outside, had exhaled. He rose slowly, letting the stiffness settle into his knees, and walked to the window. The graveyard was still, but no longer in that unnatural too-still way it had been for years. It simply looked tired, not haunted, not cursed, just a place where the dead slept and the living passed through. He saw the dew hanging off the tall grass, like tiny beads of glass, saw the light slanting through the crooked branches of the willow, and the swing empty, unmoving. A breeze moved across the yard, gentle but real, and it carried no scent of ink, no whisper of breath not belonging to him. It smelled only of wet leaves, moss, and the faint sweetness of late autumn decay. Elias turned from the window and set about his morning ritual. But it was different now. The tea wasn't made out of habit, but for comfort. The stove lit not to stave off something waiting in the shadows, but simply because the room was cold. And when he sat back down at the table, it was not with the burden of knowing the diary was watching him. It was with the understanding that he had survived it, that he had written the final word, that the story, at least the one that had threatened to consume him, was closed. But memory is a creature all its own. He reached into his coat and pulled out the red journal. Its weight remained the same, though it no longer hummed or warmed to his touch. It was just a book now, just leather and thread and paper. But within it was everything he had endured, every moment where reality had frayed, every image of those silent watchers, the chapel, the trapdoor, the bloodless voice beneath the floor. He flipped through the pages, not quickly, not searching for anything, but moving gently, like one might thumb through an old friend's letters. And then he stopped, a page that hadn't been there before, blank, completely blank. No smudges, no flecks, no folds, crisp as freshly milled parchment. He stared at it for a long time, longer than he should have, trying to decide whether this was an invitation or a reminder. He did not pick up his pen. Instead, he closed the book, stood, and stepped outside. The wind met him at the door like an old companion, brushing the edges of his coat and threading through the loose strands of his beard. The sun was higher now, clearing the line of trees along the eastern ridge, bathing the rows of headstones in light that made even the oldest markers gleam with momentary youth. He walked among them, slowly, boots sinking slightly in the soft earth hands behind his back. He passed names he'd read 1,000 times. Some he'd buried himself. Others had long since faded into lichen and time. At row 7 he paused. Elsie's grave remained unchanged. The soil was undisturbed, the grass trimmed short. The swing hung still behind her, casting a long shadow on the dewy ground. But something was missing. Not something physical. A presence. An echo. The soft tug on the air that had once whispered songs in the wind. Gone. The silence here was clean, like a wound finally healed. He knelt, pressed a hand to the stone, and murmured, "You're free." Not to her, to the space, to the memory, to himself. He rose and walked on. At the far edge of the cemetery, where the newer plots met the tree line, he saw a fresh mound of earth. No headstone yet, just a wooden marker stuck in the soil, still bearing the smudged signature of the gravedigger's chalk. He'd approved this one last week before the final nights. An older man, no family left. A quiet burial, no visitors. Elias wondered now if perhaps it would be the last. He turned to head back, his eyes scanning the boundaries of the graveyard. The fences were intact, the gates closed. The land was calm, but as he walked past the western wall, something caught his eye. A figure standing just beyond the fence, not threatening, not watching, simply there, tall, wrapped in a dark coat, wide-brimmed hat casting the face into shadow. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It stood with a kind of stillness Elias recognized. Not predatory, purposeful. He stopped. For a moment, neither moved. The wind passed between them, rustling the grass. Then Elias gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. The figure nodded back, and then it turned, stepped into the tree line, and vanished between the trunks. Elias stood in place for a long time, thinking. There had always been another. The next one. The land doesn't stay quiet forever. Not truly. Not completely. Some places are made of more than dirt and roots. Some places are made of story, and stories by nature long to be told. But maybe it won't be written this time. Maybe the next one will listen longer before picking up the pen. Or maybe inevitably the ink will call again. But that Elias decided would not be his concern. Not anymore. He walked back toward the cottage, the red journal tucked beneath his arm. And behind him the soil slept, for now. The days that followed unfolded with a strange softness, as if the graveyard itself were exhaling in slow increments, unwinding from a coil that had been pulled too tight for too long. The air was different now, cooler, cleaner, with no trace of that old mineral scent that had clung to every gust like something rusting just below the grass. Elias moved through his routines with a kind of quiet reverence, not out of fear or tradition, but as a man stepping back into his own life after years of living someone else's. He swept the cottage floor, repaired the latch on the eastern gate, trimmed the ivy near the mausoleums. The land welcomed it, not with signs or omens, but with stillness, the way a forest settles when it no longer feels threatened, the way an old dog lays its head down once it knows the house is safe. But there were traces, subtle remnants of what had passed. The swing still creaked, sometimes not rhythmically, not eerily, but with the groan of aged wood settling after long tension. The ground around the chapel, where the chapel used to be, remained unnaturally smooth, as though the grass there refused to grow with the same untamed wildness as everywhere else. Sometimes, in the last light before dusk, Elias would catch a flicker of something along the treetops, a shape moving with just a bit too much intention, a figure standing a bit too still between the trunks, but it would vanish before he could focus, as if reality itself refused to entertain lingering echoes. He did not speak of it. There was no one to speak to. And more importantly, there was no need. He knew in his marrow that silence now served a greater purpose than words ever had in this place. He kept the red journal, but no longer wrote in it. It sat atop the shelf beside the window, tucked between an old gardening manual and a small collection of field notes about local birds. Sometimes he touched it, not to open, not to tempt, just to feel the leather under his fingers, to remind himself that it remained closed by choice, not by force. And that made all the difference. One morning, as he stepped outside with a cup of tea, he found something strange. A stone had been placed at the base of the willow tree. Small, smooth, pale, rounded like river rock, though no river ran near the cemetery. There were no markings on it, no symbols, but Elias recognized the gesture. It was a token, a sign of thanks, or perhaps a farewell. He didn't move it. He left it where it was, and every morning after he nodded to it as he passed, as one might nod to a familiar neighbor. A quiet agreement that whatever had once existed between them, terror connection memory, had been resolved. Weeks passed. The frost came early that year, crisping the grass beneath his boots and painting the headstones in a fine silver sheen each dawn. The leaves turned in sharp, blazing colors before falling in wide, lazy spirals, blanketing the cemetery in rust and gold. He raked them slowly, carefully, almost artistically, small arcs around the graves, neat piles near the gates. He took pride in the rhythm of it, in the way order returned, not through force, but through care. And though the nights grew colder and longer, he did not light the candle with the same desperation as before. Sometimes he left it unlit entirely, letting the dark settle over the cottage like a soft quilt, trusting that nothing waited in its folds until the letter arrived. There had never been mail here. The postman hadn't come up the gravel path in nearly a decade. Deliveries stopped at the town's edge, and Elias had never asked them to resume. So the envelope's presence on his doorstep that morning was as unsettling as it was unexpected. No footprints in the frost, no sign of approach. Just a small white envelope with his name handwritten in fine, deliberate script. No stamp, no return address. He picked it up, felt its weight barely more than the paper itself, and stepped inside before opening it. The tea had gone cold by the time he slid the letter from its envelope. The paper was thick, textured, expensive, in a way that reminded him of old certificates or estate documents, but the words were brief. To the keeper of Whisper Hollow, we understand the story has changed. This is not a reprimand. This is a recognition. You ended it with care. That matters. But endings rarely stay that way. A new site has awakened. A new house waits. There will be another, and they may need guidance. Should you choose, your counsel is requested. Instructions to follow. There was no signature, just a faint watermark at the bottom corner of the page, a quill crossed with a spade. Elias folded the letter slowly, carefully, then sat down at the table and stared out the window for a long time. Beyond the cemetery, the treetops stirred in the wind, their branches stretching toward the pale sky like fingers brushing against the fabric of some great unseen story waiting to be told. He did not know if he would answer. He did not know if he should, but he knew one thing. Somewhere beneath new soil, another diary was waking, and it too would ask to be filled. The letter remained on the table for 3 days. Elias didn't move. It didn't fold it again, or hide it away. Just let it rest there, fully visible. Its soft cream paper catching the changing light from the window and casting a faint shadow on the old oak surface beneath. Every time he passed the table, he glanced at it. Not in hesitation, not with fear, with something closer to respect. The kind of respect one gives a locked box, acknowledging its presence, its potential, but refusing to turn the key until one is certain they can accept what waits inside. The phrase that lingered most wasn't the one about the new site, or the house, or the awakening. It was the line at the center, perfectly placed. You ended it with care. That matters. There was a weight in those words that felt too deliberate to be casual, too personal to be procedural. Someone, or something, had been watching, not just recording his choices. but judging them, acknowledging the difference between suppression and conclusion, between violence and closure. And that mattered. It had to matter. Because without that, what had any of it meant? He thought about the other keepers, those whose names were never spoken aloud, whose bones now lined the memories of this place. He wondered if they had ever received such a letter, if the choice had ever been offered to them, or if their fates had been sealed the moment they picked up the pen. He remembered Yarrow, stiff and brittle in the chair beneath the cottage floor, and the others he had only known by the absence they left behind. None of them had been given the chance to refuse, but he had. And he had done more than refuse, he had unwritten. Still, he couldn't shake the sense that the letter was not simply a thank you. It was a pivot, an opening of another door, one even older than the black diary, one not shaped by ink, but by inheritance. The quill crossed with the spade wasn't just a symbol of record and burial. It was a covenant, the burden of memory paired with the weight of the earth. And now, it had found its way to him. On the fourth morning, Elias finally folded the letter and placed it inside the red journal. The journal felt even lighter now, as though acknowledging that its final task had shifted from being written to simply preserving. He set it on the shelf again, then packed a small bag, a change of clothes, a weathered scarf, a tin of tea leaves. The silver mirror from the chapel cracked now, but intact, and one blank notebook. Not red, not black, just plain cloth-bound parchment, unmarked, unnamed. He stood at the door for a long time, one hand on the knob, his eyes scanning the familiar outline of the graveyard. The sun was already rising, catching the frost on the grass and making it shimmer like sugar. The air was cold, but not cruel. Somewhere a crow called once, then fell silent. It felt final, but just as he was about to step outside, he turned. The cottage was quiet, unchanged, exactly as he had kept it. Yet something tugged at him, not visually, not through sound. A memory. Or perhaps not a memory at all, but an impression. A place in the mind shaped not by events, but by feeling. He stepped back inside. Kneeling near the hearth, he reached behind the bricks where once he had hidden the black diary during the first month of his tenure, before he understood it could never truly be hidden. He touched the empty space now and found, to his surprise, a slip of paper. He pulled it free. It wasn't old, there was no yellowing, no crinkle, no mold. The ink was fresh, a single sentence scrawled in his own handwriting, though he had never written it. The next one won't be afraid of writing. He stared at it. The words weren't ominous. They weren't a threat. They were a statement of fact. A prophecy, maybe, or a reminder. Whoever came next wouldn't fight the diary like he had. They'd embrace it, perhaps even seek it, and that was what truly unsettled him. Not the idea of another haunting, but the idea of someone inviting it. He folded the paper, placed it back behind the brick, then rose. Some things belonged to the walls of this place. Some truths didn't need to travel with him. He opened the door and stepped into the morning. The road leading out of Whisper Hollow was narrow and uneven, but it stretched clear through the tree line, winding toward something far beyond the hills, something unnamed, unwritten. And that was the draw. Not the next graveyard, not the next haunted field, but the unknown, the chance to meet what waited before the ink touched paper. As he walked, the wind moved through the trees with gentle purpose. No voices, no sighs, just air and leaf and the slow rhythm of footsteps receding into distance. By midday, the graveyard was no longer visible behind him, and by evening, the first curl of chimney smoke rose from a hillside not marked on any of his old maps. A new house, set back from the road, windows shuttered, a porch missing a single plank. and a figure just barely visible behind the front door glass, waiting, not watching, not moving. Just waiting. Elias stood still, took a breath, then stepped forward toward whatever came next. Because some stories don't end, they just change narrators. The first thing Elias noticed as he stepped onto the property was how utterly silent the ground felt. Not quiet, not hushed, but silent in that oppressive vacuumed way that only certain places manage, where even the wind seems afraid to speak too loudly. The trees bordering the crooked path stood closer together, here trunks leaning inward as if whispering secrets to each other, their limbs forming a canopy too dense for sunlight to cut through. The grass underfoot was pale and short, as if trimmed not by human hands, but by the absence of time. He walked slowly, not out of fear, but in deference. Whatever this place was, it had already announced itself with its stillness. It did not welcome it, permitted. The house came into full view as the final tree line fell away behind him. 2 stories, stone and wood, older than it had any right to be. The shutters on the windows were nailed shut from the outside, and above the front door a single black lantern hung from a rusted iron hook, unlit and cold. The house was silent, but it was not empty. Something within it waited in a way that was deeply human, patient, expectant, like a breath held behind a closed mouth. There were no lights, no movement, no sign of life. Yet Elias felt observed in the intimate way one is observed by memory, not with eyes, but with familiarity, as if the house already knew him, as if it had been built for him. He approached the steps slowly, his boots pressing lightly against the stone path, which was covered in a thin sheen of frost, despite the mildness of the day. The front door had no knocker, no bell, no adornment, just a brass handle dulled with age. The glass pane at the top was frosted over, opaque and dust-streaked, but through it, Elias thought he saw a silhouette move only slightly, as though backing away into deeper rooms. He lifted his hand to knock, then stopped. He lowered it instead. There was no need. The door creaked open a moment later, unassisted, swinging inward by an inch. He stepped across the threshold. The air inside was warmer than expected, thick with the scent of old wood, burnt pine, and something else familiar, sharp, impossible to place. It wasn't rot, but the memory of rot. It wasn't ink, but the echo of ink. A scent that made you think of writing even before you saw the pages. The front room was dim, though candles had been lit and left burning in sconces along the walls. Their flames didn't flicker. The light did not cast moving shadows. Instead, it created a space where nothing seemed to breathe, where the walls themselves appeared frozen in the moment of their illumination. He took one step forward. The door closed softly behind him. The house was alive in the way certain places are aware, dormant but alert. There was no dust, no clutter, no signs of hurried departure or recent arrival. Everything was in place. The furniture was modest, the wallpaper faded but intact, and on a small table in the hallway stood a single object, a leather-bound book, not a diary, not yet, but a blank ledger. Beside it sat a pen. Elias stood in front of it and did not touch either. Not yet. He moved deeper into the house. The air remained still. A staircase rose to the right, curving gently upward into shadows. To the left, an open archway led into a sitting room, the hearth empty but clean, with 3 high-backed chairs set in a semicircle around it, none facing fully toward the fire, all angled slightly inward. He walked through the arch and paused beside one of the chairs. There was a book resting on the armrest, open dog-eared. A sentence had been underlined in red pencil. "We do not record to remember. We record to make forgetting impossible." He felt that line slide into him like a splinter. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. He turned. He hadn't seen anyone. Hadn't heard a voice. But he wasn't alone. Not in the way haunted places pretend you're alone. No, this was different. He was expected. This house had been prepared. And whatever waited above the stairs was not a ghost. It was the future. He made his way back to the hallway table. The ledger sat still. The pen remained uncapped, the tip clean. He stared at the cover. There was no name, no symbol, no history. And that was the danger. A blank page can become anything. He reached into his coat and removed the red journal. He opened it to the last page where the letter had been folded and tucked. He removed it, unfolded it, and reread the closing line. There will be another, and they may need guidance. He set the letter beside the ledger. He did not pick up the pen. Not yet. He walked toward the stairs, climbed them slowly, each step testing the creak of aged wood. At the top was a narrow hallway lined with doors. Some were open bedroom study storage, empty, quiet, untouched. But one door at the end of the hall stood slightly ajar. Inside, candlelight flickered, not steady like below, alive. He pushed it open and stepped into the room. It was a study. Simple, bare. A desk, a chair, a small bookshelf containing exactly 3 books. On the desk sat a second ledger, closed, unmarked, but not blank. The edges of its pages were frayed, worn from years of turning. Elias approached, opened it, and flipped to the center. There, in careful slanted handwriting, was a name. Lena Hollow, gravekeeper, 1872-1894. He turned another page. Daniel Vell, gravekeeper, 1895-1937. Another page. Ira Tolland, gravekeeper, 1938-1970. No further entries, nothing after that, until now. The pages that followed were blank, waiting, but for whom? He looked up. A mirror hung on the wall across from the desk. It was plain, round, and clean, and in its reflection, Elias saw the door behind him beginning to close, not by force, by invitation. And so he nodded, not in surrender, in understanding. The pen downstairs had not been for him. It had been set out for the next one. Elias stood before the mirror, watching as the door behind him eased shut without a sound, the gap narrowing until only a sliver of hallway light remained, then finally extinguishing altogether. The room settled into candlelight. Not dim, not dramatic, just enough. Enough to see the desk, enough to read a name, enough to feel the weight of the stories resting on shelves like sleeping animals. His reflection stared back at him with more clarity than any mirror had offered in years. Not warped, not lagging, just honest. The lines beneath his eyes, the gray in his beard, the way his posture had settled with the gravity of time. He didn't look tired. He looked done, not in defeat, but in completion, the kind of finish that comes with certainty, the kind that frees a man to leave the table and walk away from the story without glancing back. He moved toward the bookshelf. 3 books, all identical in size, bound in aged leather spine, unmarked, their weight dense with time. He pulled one free Lena Hollows based on the thickness and opened to the first page. The handwriting was narrow, crisp, each line carefully spaced. But it wasn't what she wrote that caught him. It was how she wrote. The ink did not bleed. The words did not waver. Her opening line was written in the voice of someone who knew she had already passed the point of return. I heard the dead singing before I knew the grave would open. The second book, Daniel Vell's, was different. Bold, confident, restless. Sentences scrawled diagonally in the margins. Pages dog-eared, sometimes doubled back. His thoughts were fragmented, raw, punctuated by sketches of symbols Elias recognized from the old ledger he once found in Whisper Hollow. There were entries marked only with dates and a few pages that had been torn out entirely. Toward the end, Daniel had written something over and over like a litany. The ink remembers more than the hand. And then came Ira Tolland's, the third and final. Short entries, sparse, measured. The man wrote like someone who no longer trusted language to obey him. His date stopped abruptly midway through 1969, followed by a single blank page. And then at the very end, one final sentence etched in faint pencil as though written in the dark. I thought I buried the last word, but I see now. It was only sleeping. Elias closed the book slowly and returned it to the shelf. 3 keepers, 3 books, 3 ends. Now a new house, a new ledger, a blank table. He descended the stairs, hand brushing the rail as he went, feeling the subtle indentations worn into the wood grooves where someone's fingers had passed again and again, night after night, descending into silence or duty, or both. At the base, the hallway waited exactly as he'd left it. The pen beside the ledger, untouched. The candle flames motionless. The windows all still shuttered, holding back whatever light or sound might try to intrude. He walked past it all, moving toward the front door, then paused. He turned back, eyes falling once more on the ledger. It hadn't changed. Still blank. Still open. Still expectant. But now he understood it was never for him. His chapter had ended elsewhere. Whisper Hollow had been his graveyard. This was someone else's fresh waiting humming with unwritten tension. He reached into his coat and withdrew a piece of paper folded 3 times. The parchment was old, the corners soft from travel. He'd written it on his final night in Whisper Hollow, before the red journal had gone cold, before the final silence had taken hold. A message, not a warning, not even advice, just a trace, a breadcrumb, something to let the next one know they weren't alone. He placed it gently beneath the ledger, anchoring it with the pen. Then for the first time in years, he walked out through a door without checking behind him. The sky was darker now, not threatening, just dim as twilight bled into early night. The wind stirred softly through the treetops. Behind him, the house stood quiet, not looming, not watching, just present, like an unopened book on a familiar shelf. Elias walked until the house disappeared behind the ridgeline, until the trees thinned and the land opened into wide rolling hills. The moon began its slow rise, and though the road ahead held no signs, no markers, he did not stop. He did not need to know where he was going. He had already learned that every story finds the one who needs it. He had been the keeper of a haunted graveyard, a recorder of stories too restless to stay buried, and for a while, a man nearly written out of himself. But now, he was simply a man walking. Somewhere behind him, someone else would find the ledger. Someone would pick up the pen. Someone would hear the stillness deepen and think, maybe I should write this down. And the house would sigh. And the land would listen. And the story, as always, would begin again. The house waited, not impatiently, not anxiously, but with the quiet confidence of something that understood time as a patient companion rather than a ruler. Days passed without the sound of a voice, without the shift of floorboards or the echo of footsteps, and yet the candles in the hallway never burned out, and the pen beside the ledger never dried. Dust did not gather. Cobwebs did not stretch across the corners. The house preserved itself, not through magic, but through memory, as if the structure had been built not with wood and stone, but with the pages of stories never allowed to end. And then one morning, fog thick on the surrounding hills, air clinging with the scent of cold leaves and distant soil, the latch on the front gate clicked open. A figure stepped onto the path. They were young, but carried themselves with the posture of someone who had already seen too much. Their coat was long, threadbare at the hem. A satchel hung over one shoulder, worn but heavy. The figure paused, taking in the silhouette of the house, the way it leaned just slightly to one side, the way the windows remained shuttered, but not hostile. There was no welcome in the air, but neither was there resistance. It was not an invitation, but an allowance. They walked slowly, boots scuffing the gravel. When they reached the porch, they hesitated, not from fear, but a kind of reverence, as though recognizing they had come to a place where silence lived deeper than sound, where decisions made would not be undone. They raised a hand to knock, paused, then simply placed their palm flat against the door. It opened. The house did not creak. It breathed, a low exhale like warmth returning to long, empty lungs. The figure stepped inside. The hallway greeted them as it had greeted Elias, with lightless candles that still burned, with walls that seemed to lean inward slightly, as though listening for the first word that might fall from a mouth. The air was thick, not unpleasantly, but like a library in the early morning, heavy with ink and wood, and the soft crackle of thoughts waiting to be caught. Their eyes fell instantly on the table. The ledger, still open, still blank, and beside it Elias's note. They unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was steady, measured, familiar in the way all things written in solitude eventually become. The note said only, "You are not the first. You won't be the last. But if you listen, truly listen, this house may speak to you before it begins to write through you. Let the ink come slowly. Let the pages earn your trust. Not every ghost needs a grave." The figure stood still for a long time after reading it. Then they set the paper down and approached the pen. They didn't pick it up. Instead, they sat at the edge of the staircase and simply waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. The house made no sound. But something began to settle around them. Not pressure, not presence, but the quiet certainty of attention. The kind of stillness that only arrives when something very old chooses to watch without judgment. When they finally rose, they didn't go for the ledger. They climbed the stairs. Their footsteps were deliberate, not slow, but intentional, each step an acknowledgement. At the top, the hallway stretched ahead, unchanged. Rooms waiting, unopened. They walked past the empty ones, past the dustless guest room, past the door that never quite latched. They stopped at the study. The door was ajar the way Elias had left it. Inside, the 3 books remained on the shelf, untouched. They walked to the desk, sat down, and opened the 3rd one, Ira's. They read, not all of it, just enough. Enough to feel the thread, the pulse that ran through every sentence. Then they closed the book and opened the drawer beneath the desk. Inside, a single candle, a box of matches, and a stone carved with a symbol they didn't yet understand. They lit the candle, placed the stone beside it, and waited again. Outside, the fog began to thin. A crow called once distant, then was gone. And in that moment, something in the walls of the house shifted, not physically, but emotionally, as if acknowledging that the next chapter was ready to be shaped, but not dictated. The figure descended the stairs once more and stood before the ledger. The pen still waited. The pages remained blank. They picked up the pen. Their hand hovered, and then without ceremony or fear, they wrote the first word. Not a name, not a date, just a phrase. "I came here to forget what remembering had done to me." The ink dried fast. The page held firm, and the house exhaled. The story had begun again, but this time it would not follow the same path, because this time the writer was not alone. Elias's note, Lena's song, Daniel's symbols, Ira's silence. They were all there now, pressed into the walls, stitched into the grain of the floorboards, humming gently through the windows whenever the wind passed just right. And outside, beneath the roots of the oldest tree, something stirred, not awake, not reaching, but listening. Because some graves do not open with shovels, they open with pens. By the 3rd night, the house had begun to speak, not in voices, not in ghostly murmurs, but in subtle shifts and impressions, in the language of intuition that settles behind the eyes when words are still asleep. The new keeper, whose name had yet to be written even by their own hand, was learning not to listen with ears, but with stillness. The kind of listening that took hours of silence to unlock. The kind that existed only when no expectation stood in its way. They slept on the second floor in the room furthest from the stairs, though no one had ever told them to. The bed had been made before they arrived. The sheets were clean. A book, untitled, blank inside, rested on the nightstand, its cover soft with wear from hands not theirs. They did not open it. Not yet. Some invitations required time. During the day, they walked the perimeter of the house, noting its edges, its limits. The land beyond the fence sloped down into a shallow hollow, and though it bore no headstones, it felt like a graveyard. Not by design, but by emotion. The air grew colder there, the light more silver than gold, and the trees bent differently. At the center of the hollow sat a single stone basin, shallow and wide, filled with water that never seemed to ripple no matter how strong the wind blew. The surface reflected nothing, not sky, not face. It simply held stillness. They did not touch it. They returned to the house before dusk each day, sensing that the walls grew more attentive once the sun dipped below the hills. The candles downstairs always lit themselves at the same moment the first shadow reached the base of the porch. And each time, the figure would sit again before the ledger opened to the single line they had written. I came here to forget what remembering had done to me. They had not written more, not because there was nothing to say, but because the house had not yet earned the next sentence. On the fifth night, something changed. The hallway, usually bathed in the amber glow of the sconces, grew darker. The flames did not die, but their light thinned, pulled inward like water drawn into stone. The shadows along the floor elongated, and the wood beneath the keeper's boots creaked not with pressure, but with memory. They returned to the study. The door was fully open now. The candle they had lit 2 nights ago still burned. The wax unmelted the flame tall and soundless. The stone beside it had shifted. No longer flat against the wood, it stood on its edge, balanced in a way that defied gravity. A symbol had emerged on its surface, faintly glowing, a circle split by a jagged vertical line, almost like a wound frozen in the act of being healed. The keeper sat not at the desk, but on the floor. They listened, and slowly they began to remember, not their past, not the years that had driven them here, but something deeper. A story older than their own voice. A rhythm. The beat of grief, not theirs. The slow, aching crawl of centuries layered beneath the earth. The sorrow of ink left unfinished. The ache of names buried without being spoken. The wind outside rose gently at first, then more forcefully, until the shutters on the lower windows rattled. The flames bent sideways, but did not go out. The keeper stood and crossed to the window overlooking the hollow. The fog had returned crawling low, and at the center where the basin had sat stood now a shape, not human, not creature, an outline tall and thin, robed in strands of shadow, its head tilted as though listening for the very breath the house dared not make. It did not move, neither did the keeper. Minutes passed. The figure did not vanish, but it also did not advance. It simply waited. That night, the keeper did not return to the bed upstairs. They sat by the ledger, the pen resting beside it like a coiled thought ready. And as the wind pressed its palms against the window panes and the walls of the house creaked not with age, but with anticipation, they opened the ledger once more. They did not write a name. They wrote a question. Is this story asking to be told? Or is it trying to be forgotten? And for the first time, the ink shimmered as it dried. Not black, but red, as if the page itself remembered another's pen, another's sacrifice. The ledger hummed quietly, almost imperceptibly. A vibration felt more than heard. And then the line beneath the question, the one that had been blank, began to fill itself in word by word, in a handwriting not their own. All stories wish to be remembered, but some must first be buried again. The keeper leaned back. The house was no longer silent. It had begun to answer, and outside, beneath the soil of the hollow, something turned, not in anger, not in hunger, but in recognition. It knew this one. It had been waiting. The morning after the ink wrote back, the house fell quiet again. But it was no longer the same silence. This was a listening silence, alert and watchful, as if the structure had inhaled deeply and now held its breath, waiting to see what the keeper would do next. The ledger remained open on the table, the question and its answer etched into the page as clearly as if someone had just written them moments ago. But the red ink had dried in a way no other ink ever had, so deep and matte. It looked like blood painted with a whisper. The pen beside it had not moved. Its tip was now stained faintly, as if it had dipped itself into memory rather than ink. The keeper, unnamed, still unclaimed by the pages of any diary, woke not from dreams, but from the hollow awareness that something had changed. Not a sound, not a sensation, but the pressure of a decision rising beneath their skin. They did not eat. They did not drink. They went straight downstairs and stood before the ledger, as though returning to an altar. The message from Elias remained tucked under the edge of the book, a quiet presence that had become less about guidance now, and more about witness. A sign that others had passed this threshold and survived, or at least endured. The keeper turned the page, blank again, but the space was not empty it invited. It asked for trust, not in the house, not in the ink, but in oneself. They picked up the pen, and without hesitation they wrote a name. Not their full name, not yet, just the first name. Maeve. The pen clicked faintly in their fingers, as if the house had nodded. With that, Maeve sat, and began. My arrival here was not an accident, but it was not entirely a choice either. Something in the world outside had thinned, and I slipped through without knowing what I left behind. Not loss, not pain, just noise. A kind of noise I no longer had the strength to carry. This place, this house, this soil, this hush doesn't feel like silence. It feels like a pause, like breath being held between stanzas of something far older than language. Maeve wrote steadily, without panic or rush, as though the words had been waiting in her chest for years, and now found their way out like a slow stream cutting through snow. She paused only once when she heard the distant creak of a door upstairs, a door she had never opened. She glanced toward the staircase but did not rise. The creak did not repeat. Instead, the candlelight shifted. The ledger grew warm beneath her hands. She turned the next page. This time, words were already waiting. Faint, faded smudge like writing submerged in shallow water for decades. She walked into the hollow barefoot. The earth did not resist her. The roots made way. Maeve blinked. She hadn't written that. She hadn't thought that. Yet it sat on the page as if it belonged there. No title, no context, just an entry plucked from the memory of the house itself. She ran her fingers over the words. They were dry. She flipped again. Another page, another line. We are not the first to speak to soil. We are only the first to listen without asking it to answer. Maeve closed the ledger. She sat very still. Then she rose, walked to the door, and stepped outside into the mid-morning fog. The house did not protest. The path down to the hollow seemed shorter this time, as if the ground no longer needed to test her willingness to return. The grass underfoot was soft, wet, and cold, but it did not bite. The trees leaned in closer now, not threatening, but like old figures craning to hear a child speak. She descended into the basin. The stone bowl stood where it always had, its surface still impossibly smooth, its water unmoved by breeze or gravity. Maeve knelt beside it, resting her palms on the moss-covered rim. She whispered nothing. She simply listened, and slowly the water shifted. Not a ripple, not a wave, a pulse. Beneath the surface she saw it, an eye. Not human, not monstrous. Something else. It didn't blink. It acknowledged. Then it vanished. The water returned to stillness. Maeve stood. When she turned to go, a path had opened behind her. Not new, but revealed like an old trail, remembered by the land itself. It led not back to the house, but away through the trees, to a section of the property she hadn't yet explored. She followed. The air was different here, thinner, less grounded. The light through the canopy above had a bluish cast, as if filtering through old glass, and the deeper she walked, the more she saw signs of others. Boot prints, feathers tied to branches, stones stacked in careful, unnatural towers. And then she saw it, a clearing. In its center, a tree taller than any she had seen on the property bark, darker than pitch, its limbs gnarled like frozen gestures of pleading. Hanging from one of the branches was a mirror, framed in iron, cracked down the middle, and in its reflection Maeve saw not herself, but Elias, sitting at his old desk, read journal, open eyes closed. Then the mirror fogged over from the inside. When it cleared, Elias was gone, and Maeve was alone again. But she knew now this place was not separate from what came before. This was the continuation, and her part had only just begun. Maeve didn't return to the house right away. She stood before the cracked mirror in the clearing, its iron frame cold to the touch, its glass now blank again, showing nothing but the blurred motion of trees behind her. The reflection of Elias had been no illusion. It had held weight, presence, a stillness that only came from something real, even if unreachable. And now, as the mirror grew dim once more, she felt it resonate, not visually, not audibly, but in the chest, deep and echoing like a bell rung underwater. The house and the land were not separate realms. They were two halves of the same mind, the same memory. And this place, this clearing, this tree, it wasn't just part of the property. It was part of the ledger, a living footnote, a margin that expanded with every word she wrote. She backed away slowly, eyes still fixed on the tree. There were carvings along its bark, layers of them etched into the twisted trunk like ancient languages written over each other, until no single line could be deciphered. Names, perhaps, or attempts at them. And between those etchings, thin veins of silver ran like old lightning scars, alive with a faint shimmer when the light hit just right. The forest thickened on her way back, though the trail did not vanish. The land was watching her now, not with suspicion, but with interest. She felt it in the way the breeze curved around her body, in how the birds paused their songs as she passed in, how the branches above swayed without a wind strong enough to move them. She passed the hollow basin again. The water was still, the eye gone. But the feeling remained, that something had looked through her, and now carried her shape behind its gaze. When she reached the porch, the door of the house was open. It hadn't been when she left. She stepped inside without hesitation. The light had changed. The candles flickered this time, not violently, but with a kind of rhythm, as if marking time. The scent in the air was different too, less like wood and more like iron, like rain falling on old stone. Maeve closed the door behind her and made her way to the ledger, which had turned a page in her absence. She hadn't touched it. No one had. And yet a new entry had begun her handwriting, but not her hand. I saw myself in a reflection that wasn't mine. A man in a forgotten room, eyes closed but dreaming. She stared at the words, then at the blank space below, then at the pen. She picked it up and continued. The mirror is not a device for vanity here. It is a window for inheritance, memory traveling backward. Elias saw the future when he left. Now I see the past. But the reflection never lingers. It just shows you what you carry. She paused. The pen hovered above the paper, a single drop of ink gathering on its tip. Then she wrote, "If the house is the archive, the land is the author. And it is not done writing." She set the pen down. The air around her changed again. The pages behind the current entry began to turn on their own, slowly, one by one, as though the book was rereading itself. reminding its own paper of the stories it had already cradled. Maeve didn't touch it. She let it move, watching the flip of parchment blur ink into motion, each flicker a lifetime. Then suddenly it stopped. Page 13. Not her writing, but familiar. Lena Hollow. Her script still sharp after all these years. He calls from beneath the hollow. Not loudly, not in words. Just a melody. Off-key. Ancient. It tugs at the base of the spine, the part of you that forgets how to walk away. I buried something there once. I don't remember what. But the earth still aches from it. Maeve reread it. Then again. The melody, the pull, the ache. She heard nothing now, but the suggestion was enough. She flipped forward again, to the final blank page, and in a whisper she could barely hear herself, she asked, "What am I supposed to find?" The candle beside her flared, a breath of heat on her face, then dimmed. On the ledger's surface, faintly new ink appeared, crawling slowly across the page without a pen, as if written by the air itself. Not all graves hold bones. Maeve stood. The house creaked once somewhere upstairs. She didn't hesitate. She took the candle, the pen, and the blank cloth-bound journal she had brought with her from the world outside. She left the ledger open on the table and climbed the stairs. At the top, the hallway waited. The same row of doors. Same hushed wood. But this time, the third door on the left was open. She stepped inside. It wasn't a bedroom. It wasn't a study. It was an attic space with no visible slope walls too high for the house's roofline. A window on the far side that showed nothing but fog, thick and endless. At the center, a chair, empty, waiting. She sat, opened her own journal, and began to write, not for the house, not for the ledger, but for herself. A parallel memory, a backup heartbeat, because she had come to understand one quiet truth. The house remembers everything, but the land only keeps what you bury. The attic space, with its impossible geometry and window that opened only to fog, became Maeve's sanctuary, not from fear, but from forgetting. She began each day here now, long before the sun breached the tree line, long before the house stirred beneath her. She would light a candle, sit in the chair with her knees drawn up, the blank journal in her lap, and listen. Not for sounds, those were distractions, but for impressions, thoughts that weren't hers, feelings with no origin. She learned quickly that the attic did not echo. It absorbed. Her breath vanished into the air. Her footsteps softened instantly on the wood, and even her heartbeat seemed to grow quieter the longer she stayed. It was as if the space was designed not to house her body, but to hold her mind in place gently but completely. Her entries in the cloth-bound journal were different from those she wrote in the ledger. In the house's book, her words carried weight-duty lineage, but here in her own pages, she allowed herself fragments, half-thoughts, dreams, images that arrived while her eyes were open, but her mind was turned sideways. She wrote of roots moving like fingers beneath the earth, of whispers pressed into stone, of figures in the tree line with no faces, only outlines of breath in the cold. On the seventh morning, a sentence wrote itself at the top of her page before she touched the pen. You buried yourself to remember what it felt like to be found. She stared at the ink for a long time, not afraid, not disturbed, but moved as if someone had spoken her truest memory out loud without asking permission. She didn't erase it. She didn't answer. She just continued writing beneath it, letting her hand catch what her mind refused to hold. That night, the wind returned. It clawed along the house like an animal, unsure if it wanted to come inside. The shutters rattled in their frames. The chimney howled low deep, like breath being forced through the throat of a sleeping giant. Maeve descended from the attic and paused at the second-floor landing. The hallway stretched out before her, familiar, now though no less uncanny. She moved toward her bedroom, but stopped. The door opposite hers had always been locked. Tonight it stood open, inside darkness, no candle, No windows, no sound. But it was not empty. She stepped across the threshold and felt the shift instantly. The floor was softer here, not carpeted, but yielding as if the wood itself had grown tired of being firm. The walls pulsed faintly with warmth, like breath held too long behind drywall. In the center of the room stood a pedestal stone square, waist high. On it, a bowl. And in the bowl, a single object, a tooth, long, human, but too large. Its root coiled slightly like it had grown in a mouth that had to make room for it. Maeve didn't move closer. She knew better now than to touch what the house presented. Instead, she whispered, "Whose was it?" The bowl vibrated slightly, and the wall behind her answered, not with voice, but with image. A slow ripple passed across the plaster, like a drop of ink spilled in water. The surface darkened. Shapes formed. A woman hunched, digging in soil with bare hands. Her nails cracked. Her breath fogged in the cold. She placed something in the ground and pressed her forehead to the earth, whispering what might have been a name or an apology. The image faded. Then another, the same woman years later, standing at the base of the tree in the clearing. Her hair gray now, her hands shaking. She held a bundle in her arms. Not a child, not an object, something in between. She laid it at the roots and walked away, never looking back. Maeve whispered again, "Lena." The wall pulsed once. The bowl's contents shifted. The tooth rolled slightly, revealing an inscription along the root, a symbol. Not language, not number. A mark. She'd seen it before, etched faintly into the cracked mirror in the clearing. And once long ago, drawn in red pencil in Daniel Vell's journal. It wasn't a letter. It was a permission. She turned and left the room. The door didn't close behind her this time. It remained open as if allowing her return. But Maeve knew the house never repeated itself exactly. Whatever had shown her those visions had done so once. It would not show them again. Downstairs, the ledger had not moved, but the next page was open, blank, expectant. She sat, took the pen, and wrote without pause. "I have seen the unmarked grave and the woman who made it. I have held no relics, spoken no oaths. Yet the house shows me what was hidden, not to burden me with knowledge, but to prepare me for return. The tooth belongs to no beast. It belongs to guilt. And guilt once buried does not die, it sharpens." She paused, listened. The house creaked once softly as if in agreement. She continued, "This house does not haunt. It remembers. It does not protect. It records. And now it asks, what have you buried that should have stayed shallow?" She lowered the pen, blew gently on the ink, then turned out the candle. The wind had stopped, and somewhere in the hollow beneath a basin of unmoving water, something exhaled for the first time in a long while. Maeve dreamed that night for the first time since arriving at the house. But the dream was not made of images, it was built from temperature, weight, and presence. She was underground, not buried, but nested, curled in a place where no light reached and no sound could rise. Around her roots moved like veins in a breathing animal. The soil was warm, not damp, not rotting, but alive, pulsing slowly, with something that resembled a heartbeat. In that subterranean hush, she felt utterly held, protected, yes, but also observed, as though the land wasn't sheltering her, but remembering her. And in the center of that silence, a single phrase whispered not to her ears, but into the marrow of her bones. Nothing forgotten stays still. She woke with tears drying along her cheeks. Not from sadness, not even from fear, but from recognition. The kind that comes when a piece of truth long buried under metaphor and denial finally breathes again. The morning light had turned gray by the time she descended to the first floor. The sky outside was overcast, but not ominous, just still. The house was colder today, as if bracing. She moved toward the ledger as she always did, but stopped short. The pages were fluttering, slowly, methodically, as if something unseen was turning them back, not forward to earlier entries. She watched as her own handwriting reversed, as Elias's final lines reappeared, as Daniel's scrawled pages and Lena's meticulous lines returned. Then the book halted on an entry she hadn't seen before. The ink was black, but old, faded to a shadowy rust at the edges. No name, just a date, October 19th, 1822. And beneath it, I asked the land to forget what I did. It said no. Then I asked it to bury me instead. It said yes. Maeve sat down. She didn't touch the page. She whispered aloud. How many have come before me? The house didn't respond, but the candle at the table flickered once. Then behind her, the front door creaked open. No wind, no sound outside. Just the door, opening, inviting. Maeve rose, slowly stepped to the threshold, and looked out across the yard. Something had changed. The trees at the edge of the forest, those that had stood crooked and heavy with moss, were straighter now. Not dramatically, but subtly, like someone had spoken to them in the night and reminded them of who they once were. The grass between the house and the basin shimmered faintly, dew catching the light in thin golden veins that pointed unmistakably toward the hollow. Maeve stepped outside. The air greeted her not with chill, but with memory. A scent she had once known as a child. Wet bark, scorched leaves, the metallic promise of rain, long before the clouds arrived. She followed the dew-lined path toward the hollow. The basin, as ever, was still, but it was no longer full. The water had receded, just an inch, just enough to reveal the stone beneath it. A carving, not the symbol from the tree, something older, sharper. A spiral carved inward ending in a dot. She knelt and ran a finger along the edge, cold, slick, the kind of surface that had not felt sunlight in decades. Then something moved behind her. She turned quickly. At the edge of the hollow stood a figure, not cloaked in shadow, not veiled by fog, just present. An old man, bareheaded, wearing a coat too thin for the air boots, caked with a dirt she hadn't seen anywhere near the house. His face was lined not with age, but with choice. The kind of weathered that comes from saying no when it would have been easier to nod. His hands hung at his sides, empty. His mouth did not open, but she heard him speak inside her. Do you understand what this place asks of you? Maeve stood. Her knees trembled. Not with fear, but the way they tremble when you finally stand in front of a truth you didn't know you'd been circling for years. She nodded. The man tilted his head slightly. The gesture was not approval, it was permission. Then he turned, walked into the tree line, and vanished. Not like smoke, not like a ghost, but like someone whose time had simply passed. Maeve stood for a long time. The water in the basin did not return. The spiral beneath the surface remained exposed. She knelt again, this time with more reverence, and pressed her palm flat to the center of the carving. The ground beneath her did not shake. The air did not darken. But something inside her chest shifted. A piece moved, one that had been still for too long. A silence cracked, and within it a name. Not her name, but a name that had been whispered to her in the dream, the one she had forgotten by morning. She turned and walked back to the house. At the threshold she paused, looked up at the eaves where the black lantern still hung. It was lit now, its flame small, steady. The house, it seemed, had begun to write with her, not just about her. Inside the ledger waited. She picked up the pen, and with her next line she wrote not as a witness, but as a participant. I am not the first to carry these pages, but I may be the first to carry them willingly. Maeve did not sleep that night, but neither did she tire. Her body felt weightless, not in the sense of levitation, but in the quiet relief of something released, an internal knot untied without ceremony. She remained in the main hall, sitting at the ledger, the last sentence still drying on the page like a final breath drawn before the plunge. Around her the candles held steady, and outside the wind made no appearance. Even the creaks and murmurs of the house had stilled, as if every beam and nail waited for what she would do next. She didn't write again, not yet. The page remained half empty, the ink bottle beside her untouched. But the air around the desk had changed. She could feel it charged awake, curious. The house no longer tested her. It listened as the clock on the mantel ticked into the next hour. Though the hands hadn't moved in days, Maeve stood and crossed to the wall where Elias's coat still hung. It hadn't aged, not even a crease added since he'd left it behind. She reached inside one of the pockets, a folded note. She hadn't placed it there. Unfolding the brittle paper, she read the lines in a script unmistakably not hers. Tight cursive slanted left, written in a rush that betrayed intention beneath panic. If the house begins to speak to you in your own voice, leave the ledger closed for 3 nights. Do not answer. It is not you writing. It is the land remembering. The edges of the note were stained as though water or something heavier had soaked into it long ago. Maeve folded it again, returned it to the pocket, and stepped away from the wall. It was a warning, or maybe a preparation. But what unsettled her most was that she had already heard her voice once, in the attic. Faint, not spoken aloud, but carried on the silence, whispering fragments into her journal before she'd written them. Had she answered? Uncertain, she climbed the stairs. The attic was colder now. The air thinner, like breathing inside a memory rather than a room. Her journal lay where she'd left it on the chair, closed, but heavier somehow. She picked it up and turned to the most recent page. A sentence had appeared beneath her last entry, in her handwriting, but not written by her. Maeve, you've been here before. You just weren't ready to remember it. She blinked. The ink shimmered faintly in the candlelight, as if still fresh. Her hand trembled, not with fear, but with recognition. She turned back 2 pages. Another line. The spiral is not a symbol. It is a door, and it opens inward. Her breathing shallowed. She flipped further back all the way to the beginning, the first page the day she'd arrived. Blank. No greeting, no first entry. Just one phrase etched deep into the paper, so faint she hadn't seen it before now. Welcome back. She stepped backward, eyes scanning the room, as though she might catch a version of herself just leaving. Nothing. The attic pulsed, once subtle like lungs learning how to expand. Maeve left the room without closing the door. She descended the stairs, not hurried, but firm, her fingers grazing the wall as though anchoring herself with touch. Back in the hallway, she turned left toward the locked room she'd entered before. It stood open again. Inside, the pedestal was gone. The tooth remained on the floor, now nestled in a small depression in the wood, as if it had grown there. She knelt beside it, watched it, waited. Then softly, almost imperceptibly, she spoke aloud. What was buried with you? The house groaned low. Behind her, the mirror in the corner, previously covered in a sheet of linen, was now exposed. Its glass rippled like water caught in windless rain. She stood slowly and approached. In the reflection, she saw herself. And behind her, the room, but also someone else. A child, small, pale, eyes wide, sitting in the far corner, arms wrapped around knees, silent. Maeve turned. Nothing. Back to the mirror. Still there. Not moving, not blinking, just watching. She whispered, "Who are you?" The reflection blinked, and in her own voice, not spoken aloud, but felt within her skull like an echo caught behind her ears, she heard the answer. "You brought me here." Maeve backed away. The mirror darkened. The image faded, but the weight of that phrase stayed with her. She had brought it. She had buried it. She had forgotten it. The spiral, the tooth, the child, all hers. Not metaphor, not vision, memory. The house had not been showing her its past. It had been unearthing hers. She returned to the ledger. The page waited, still half empty. She dipped the pen in ink, then wrote, "I am the story that buried itself so deeply it began to believe it was the soil." And the house for the first time sighed, a long, slow breath that passed through every wall, every floorboard, every space between beams, as if releasing something it had held for too long. Outside, the fog lifted, only slightly, but enough to see the path. And down that path, something moved, not away, toward her. The path outside the house, now barely visible through the lifting fog, stretched farther than Maeve remembered it. Before, it had always ended at the hollow, or curved sharply into the woods that held their breath too tightly. But this morning, if it was still morning, the air hung open like an exhale finally given, and the path continued uninterrupted down into a thicket of ash trees she hadn't seen before. She stood on the porch journal, pressed to her chest, the house at her back. Behind her, the ledger remained open, the final sentence still gleaming wetly on the page. I am the story that buried itself so deeply it began to believe it was the soil. It hadn't just felt true, it was true. And now that she had written it, the house had let go of something it hadn't even known it was holding. Maeve stepped off the porch. The wind didn't blow, but the trees whispered anyway. Not with language, but with motion. Their branches turned toward her slightly, as she passed leaves trembling as though brushing her name through the air. She followed the new path deeper and deeper into the ash grove. The ground beneath her softened with each step. Not mud, but memory. The kind of softness that comes when footsteps are retraced after many years' soil long compressed. Now remembering how to give. Then the grove opened. A wide clearing circular ringed with stones, and in the center, a table carved from a single slab of obsidian. Flat, smooth weighting. Upon it a box, iron, small, unlocked. Maeve didn't approach immediately. She circled the edge of the clearing, eyes scanning the trees, the stones, the sky. There was no sound, no birds, no breeze. Even her own breath seemed to vanish before it reached her ears. She stepped forward, boots nearly silent on the moss. The box was old, unadorned. The kind of object meant not to invite curiosity, but to contain it. She stood over it, then slowly, very slowly lifted the lid. Inside, a set of papers folded once, thin, yellowed. She reached in and removed the top one. It was a drawing, not a map, a face, a child's sketch done with charcoal-thick lines, uneven pressure. The face was familiar, her own. Maeve staggered slightly, eyes widening. She turned the page over. A date, September 17th, 1997. No signature, but beneath the date, in the same shaky hand, I saw her in the mirror again. She cried. I didn't know if it was me. Maeve dropped to her knees beside the table. She pulled the rest of the papers from the box, each one stranger than the last. A spiral, drawn again and again, until the charcoal tore through the page. A page covered in her own name, written hundreds of times, each smaller than the last, ending in a single red smudge. A crude drawing of a room with no windows and a door that had no handle. Then the final page, blank, but as she held it, her fingers trembled, not with cold, with memory. It came in flashes like cracks of lightning seen through closed eyes. A basement, a mirror, a voice whispering her name when no one else was home. Drawing spirals on the wall with the tip of a screwdriver. Burying something behind the furnace. Her mother asking why she cried in her sleep. The ache in her gums when she lost a tooth that never stopped bleeding. She hadn't come here to forget. She had come here because forgetting had broken her. The house hadn't lured her. It had called her back. Not as punishment, as reconciliation. She stood slowly, the last page in her hand. The box was now empty. The clearing darker than before. She turned and walked back up the path. The fog had returned thinner, but enough to curl around her shoulders like a familiar weight. When she stepped back into the house, the temperature had shifted. Warmer, more human, not welcoming, but no longer testing. She moved to the ledger, placed the final page from the box on top of the open book, then wrote beneath it, "Memory is not a ghost, it is a witness, and I am no longer hiding from mine." She signed it, for the first time, full name, Maeve Ellery Rowan. The ledger did not react, but behind her the fire in the hearth roared to life, unprompted, and upstairs in the attic her journal flipped a page on its own. The house had accepted her, not as guest, as keeper. And far below, beneath the basin, something ancient, something shaped like guilt and grief and childhood, finally closed its eyes. Night fell like a heavy curtain, dense and quiet, settling around the house with a weight that pressed against the windows and soaked into the walls. Maeve sat in the attic with her knees pulled to her chest, the journal open but untouched in her lap. She didn't write tonight. There was nothing to add. Not yet. The house had spoken, the land had answered, and now everything waited not with dread, but with ceremony. A final act unannounced, moving closer, like the last few notes of a song remembered from long ago. She had lit only one candle, and its flickering glow barely reached the corners of the room. Shadows crowded there now, not threatening, but attentive. Maeve could feel them watching, not with eyes, but with memory. They had seen other keepers come and go. They had seen her before long ago, as a child, as a whisper, and now fully present. She stood, every bone in her body heavy with clarity, and descended to the second floor. The hallway stretched ahead like a spine, each door a vertebra, each creak beneath her feet a pulse. The door at the far end, one she had never opened, stood ajar. No wind, no draft, just invitation. She stepped inside. The room was smaller than expected. Square. Bare floorboards, no windows, no furniture. The walls were made of dark, weathered wood that didn't match any other part of the house. On the far side was a mirror, full length, tall enough to dwarf her reflection. It wasn't cracked. It wasn't fogged. It showed her perfectly, and beside it, mounted on the wall, a hook. A single iron key hung from it. Maeve didn't hesitate. She took the key, turned back toward the hall, walked down the stairs, slow and steady, every step echoing back into the house like footsteps, long buried, being retraced. The cellar door waited in the kitchen behind the pantry, barely visible. It had no knob, only a lock. The key fit. The mechanism turned with a reluctant click. The door opened downward. A breath of cold air rushed out, damp, ancient, full of forgotten things. She descended. The cellar was stone carved deep into the ground. She carried no light, but the space seemed to glow faintly with its own memory. The floor was dirt, the walls rough, and at the far end, a box, larger than the one in the grove. Wooden, sealed with wax at the edges, ropes wrapped tightly around it. She stepped closer. The box did not hum, did not shake, did not whisper. It remembered. Every name written in the ledger, every footstep across the hollow, every buried tooth, every drawing, every forgotten dream. Maeve reached out and touched the lid. It was warm. Her fingers trembled. She whispered, "Do I open you?" No answer, just silence, and then movement. Behind her, she turned. The child, the same girl from the mirror, pale, quiet, wide-eyed. She didn't speak, she didn't blink, but she lifted her hand and pointed to the box. Maeve turned back, broke the seal, lifted the lid. Inside fabric, white, folded, smooth as snow, untouched by wind. She pulled it free. A dress, small, for a child, and beneath it a mirror shard, wrapped in ribbon. She stared. The child stepped forward slowly and placed one hand on the edge of the box. Their fingers touched, and in that contact, the memories came not as visions, but as sensations. Cold floor beneath small feet. Darkness, hiding in corners, that called her by name. A mother's voice, afraid to say goodbye. A name whispered to herself again and again, so she wouldn't forget it. Maeve. The child wasn't a ghost. She was what Maeve had left behind, the part that had buried itself to survive, the part that had waited. Maeve knelt, tears slipping silently down her face. She whispered, "I remember you now." The girl nodded and smiled, then faded, not disappeared, joined, reclaimed. Maeve stood alone in the cellar, the box still open, the dress folded, the mirror shard pulsing with a soft light that didn't reflect anything at all, only absorbed. She took the shard, wrapped it in her hand, carried it up the stairs. Back to the ledger, she opened to the final page, wrote, "I am whole again. The child I buried was never meant to die, only to wait." She waited long enough. The candle at her side guttered once, then rose tall and still. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, not with warning, but with rhythm, like a lullaby, like a story ending, or beginning again. Dawn came gently, the first light soft as breath against the frost-glazed windows. Maeve sat at the desk with her hands resting atop the closed ledger. her fingers quiet, still slightly stained with ink and soil. The mirror shard lay beside her, no longer pulsing. Its surface had faded to opaque gray, no reflection remaining, only depth, a kind of silent gravity that promised not answers, but rest. The house had changed again overnight, not visibly. The walls hadn't moved, the stairs hadn't creaked in new places, but the weight of the place had shifted. It no longer leaned forward with anticipation. It had settled like an old story finally told aloud, no longer needing to stir in the dark. The silence inside was warm now, not hollow but full. Maeve stood and walked to the hearth. The fire had long since gone out, yet the stone still radiated faint heat, as though the memory of flame lingered. She crouched there, placing the mirror shard in the ash. It did not crack or spark. It simply sank, as if the house accepted it without ceremony as part of itself. She moved to the front door and opened it. The fog had lifted completely. For the first time, the horizon was visible, rolling hills beyond the edge of the grove, the faint silver line of a creek catching the sun in long, slanting strokes. The path that had led to the grove now forked in two directions, one back into the woods, one farther into the distance. She did not pack. The house had not offered her a bed, a bag, or a room with a lock. It had offered something older reclamation. Maeve turned to look back once more. The black lantern still hung above the porch. Flame, extinguished glass, cracked slightly at the rim. Below it, carved into the wood of the door, faint shallow, like the trail of a nail, was her name. Not carved by her, carved for her. She smiled, then stepped off the porch. The house behind her made no sound, but the trees beside the path bent gently in the breeze. As she walked, the land did not resist her. It welcomed her, not because she belonged to it, but because she had finally remembered what it was to come home. And far below, beneath the basin and the roots and the stone spiral, something long buried exhaled, not in pain, but in peace. You're still here. That means you made it through all 30 chapters of the Gravekeeper's diary. Maybe you're lying in bed right now, eyes closed, the story playing like a dim dream just behind your thoughts. Or maybe you're still awake, mind gently floating between the woods, the house, and the pages of a ledger that no longer asks questions. What you've just experienced wasn't about fear. Not really. It was about the slow unearthing of memory, the way stories live inside places, and the quiet courage it takes to face what we once tried to forget. There was no monster waiting at the door, no scream in the attic, just a girl and a house and a silence full of old names. And now that silence is yours too. So as your breath slows and the edges of the night begin to soften, let go of what you carried here. Let Maeve's footsteps fade behind you. Let the lantern dim. Let the path curve gently back into dream. You've walked through memory, through mist, through mirrors that didn't always reflect what you expected, but you arrived, and you are still whole. Let the house close its eyes now. Let the trees still. Let the story end, not with a scream, but with a sigh. You've earned your rest.